Polar bear destroys $80,000 SUV, kills tourist couple. November 7th, 2024. The morning of November 4th, 2024, dawned crisp and clear across the Hudson Bay lowlands, with temperatures hovering at -18 degrees Celsius and a biting northwestern wind that carried the promise of the approaching Arctic winter. Paul Michael Reynolds, 43 years old, successful investment banker from Toronto, stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Seal River Heritage Lodge, watching the first pale light of dawn creep across the endless expanse of frozen tundra that stretched toward the bay. His wife, Diana Catherine Reynolds, 39, a marketing executive for a prominent pharmaceutical company, remained curled beneath the heavy down comforter of their king-sized bed, her auburn hair splayed across the pillow as she savored these final moments of warmth before another day of their once-in-a-lifetime polar bear viewing expedition. Paul had meticulously planned this trip for over 18 months, coordinating schedules, making reservations, and researching every aspect of their journey to what National Geographic had dubbed the polar bear capital of the world. Churchill, Manitoba, population barely 800 souls, served as the launching point for thousands of tourists each year who came to witness the magnificent apex predators of the Arctic as they gathered along the shores of Hudson Bay, waiting for the sea ice to form so they could return to their hunting grounds. The Reynolds had invested nearly $28,000 in this adventure, including first-class flights from Toronto to Winnipeg, the train journey to Churchill, 5 nights at the luxury Eco Lodge, guided tundra vehicle tours, and the crown jewel of their itinerary, a private helicopter tour, followed by a self-guided drive in a specially equipped Land Rover Defender through the remote Wapusk National Park region. Diana stirred as Paul moved away from the window, her green eyes opening to focus on her husband's silhouette against the Arctic landscape. "What time is it?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep and the residual effects of the wine they had shared the previous evening, while listening to their guide, Marcus Thompson, regale them with stories of polar bear encounters spanning his 15-year career leading tours in the region. "Just past 7, Paul replied, turning back toward her with a smile that had charmed her through 12 years of marriage. "I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about today, about actually being out there alone with just us and the bears. No crowds, no other tourists chattering away and ruining the magic." Diana pulled herself upright, the comforter falling away to reveal the thermal underwear she had worn to bed, a necessity in the lodge despite its modern heating system. Through the windows, she could see the vast white expanse that surrounded their temporary home, broken only by the dark silhouettes of stunted spruce trees and the occasional movement of Arctic foxes darting between the sparse vegetation. The landscape held a terrible beauty, simultaneously breathtaking and forbidding, a reminder that they were guests in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The couple had met Marcus Thompson 3 days earlier when they first arrived at the lodge, a weathered man of 52 whose deep-set blue eyes held the wisdom of someone who had spent more than half his life reading the subtle signs of the Arctic wilderness. Thompson stood 6 feet tall, with the lean, muscular build of someone accustomed to physical labor in extreme conditions, his graying beard and wind-burned features telling the story of countless hours exposed to the elements. He had guided everyone from wildlife photographers to celebrity adventurers, but he approached each tour with the same careful attention to detail and respect for the power of the animals they had come to observe. "The bears are getting restless," Thompson had told them the previous evening as they sat in the lodge's main room, nursing glasses of locally distilled whiskey while the wind howled outside. "We've had an unusually warm autumn, and the bay ice is forming later than normal. That means the bears have been fasting longer than usual, and they're getting desperate. A desperate polar bear is one of the most dangerous predators on the planet." Thompson's warning echoed in Paul's mind as he began pulling on the layers of specialized Arctic clothing that would protect him during their upcoming adventure. The guide had spent nearly an hour the day before explaining the proper layering system: moisture-wicking base layers, insulating middle layers, and windproof outer shells, along with the critical importance of protecting extremities from frostbite in the brutal Arctic conditions. Each piece of equipment had been carefully selected and tested, from the heated insoles in their boots to the emergency communication devices that would allow them to call for help if something went wrong. Diana began her own preparations, the ritual of dressing for Arctic conditions having become familiar over their days at the lodge. She pulled on the merino wool base layers, then the fleece insulation, followed by the windproof pants and jacket that would serve as her final defense against the elements. The clothing was bulky and restrictive, making her feel like an astronaut preparing for a spacewalk. But she understood its necessity. The Arctic was unforgiving to those who failed to respect its power. Their breakfast in the lodge's dining room was a subdued affair, the nervous energy of anticipation affecting their appetites, despite the hearty fare prepared by the lodge's chef, a transplant from Montreal named François Dubois, who had come north 15 years earlier for a single season and never left. Dubois, a compact man of 45, with calloused hands and an easy smile, had developed a reputation for creating meals that provided the calories and nutrients needed to sustain visitors during their Arctic adventures, while also offering comfort and familiarity to those overwhelmed by the alien landscape outside. "You're going to see things today that most people only dream about," Dubois told them, as he served plates of thick-cut bacon, scrambled eggs, and golden hash browns alongside steaming mugs of dark coffee. "But remember what Marcus has taught you. Respect the bears, respect the land, and respect your own limitations. The Arctic doesn't forgive mistakes." Other guests in the dining room spoke in hushed tones about their own planned activities for the day, most involving guided tours in heated tundra vehicles that would keep them safely separated from the wildlife they had come to observe. An elderly couple from Germany, Klaus and Ingrid Weber, were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with a photography tour led by Thompson's colleague, Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old wildlife biologist who had moved to Churchill after completing her doctoral studies at the University of Manitoba. A group of college students from the University of Wisconsin was preparing for a day-long educational tour that would combine wildlife viewing with lessons about climate change and its impact on polar bear populations. But Paul and Diana had chosen a different path, one that would take them away from the relative safety of guided tours and into the raw wilderness that lay beyond the boundaries of the established tourist routes. Their private helicopter tour, scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock, would fly them deep into Wapausk National Park, where they would be dropped off with a specially equipped Land Rover Defender for a self-guided exploration of one of the most pristine polar bear habitats remaining on Earth. The helicopter pilot, Captain James "Jimmy" Mackenzie, had been flying in the Arctic for over 20 years, accumulating more than 8,000 hours of flight time in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. Mackenzie, a former military pilot who had served in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian aviation, understood the unique challenges of operating aircraft in the extreme cold and shifting weather patterns of the Arctic. His Bell 407 helicopter had been modified specifically for Arctic operations, with enhanced heating systems, cold weather lubricants, and emergency equipment that could mean the difference between life and death if something went wrong. At 8:30, Mackenzie arrived at the lodge to conduct his final briefing with Paul and Diana, his presence commanding immediate attention. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, Mackenzie wore a flight suit adorned with patches from his military service and commercial aviation career. His eyes, a sharp grey that seemed to miss nothing, studied the couple as he explained the details of their upcoming flight. "We'll be flying approximately 45 minutes northwest to a remote area of Wapusk, where the bears are known to concentrate this time of year," Mackenzie explained, spreading a detailed topographical map across the lodge's conference table. "The landing zone is here, about 12 kilometers inland from the bay, on a slight elevation that provides good visibility in all directions. The Land Rover will be waiting for you, fully fueled and equipped with emergency supplies, communication equipment, and everything you need for a safe exploration." The plan called for Mackenzie to drop them off at 10 o'clock and return for pickup at 4 o'clock, giving them 6 hours to explore the area at their own pace. The Land Rover had been positioned the previous day by Thompson and his ground crew, who had used snowmobiles to transport fuel, emergency supplies, and the specialized equipment needed to ensure the vehicle would start reliably in the extreme cold. "Remember," Mackenzie continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen the consequences of poor decisions in unforgiving environments, "the radio check-ins are mandatory every hour. If I don't hear from you at the scheduled times, I'll assume you're in trouble and initiate emergency procedures. The satellite phone is your backup communication, and the GPS beacon will bring help to your exact location if you activate it." Diana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold as she studied the map, noting the vast empty spaces between their planned location and the nearest permanent settlements. The nearest occupied building was a research station 40 kilometers to the south, manned by a team of 3 scientists studying the impact of climate change on Arctic ecosystems. The nearest hospital was in Churchill, nearly 60 kilometers away by helicopter, assuming weather conditions permitted flight. Paul, however, seemed energized by the isolation and potential dangers they would face. As a successful investment banker who spent his days in climate-controlled offices making decisions that affected millions of dollars but rarely faced genuine physical challenges, the prospect of encountering one of the world's apex predators in its natural habitat represented the kind of authentic experience that money couldn't buy in the civilized world. "What are the odds we'll actually see bears?" Paul asked, his excitement evident in his voice. Mackenzie's expression grew serious. "In this area, at this time of year, I'd say the chances are very high, maybe too high. The bears are concentrated here because this is where the bay ice typically forms first, and they've been waiting weeks longer than usual. They're hungry, stressed, and increasingly bold. Thompson has reported unusual behavior in recent weeks, with bears approaching human settlements and showing less fear of people than normal." The helicopter flight began precisely at 9 o'clock, with Mackenzie executing a smooth takeoff that lifted them above the lodge and out over the seemingly endless expanse of the Hudson Bay lowlands. Below them, the landscape unfolded like a scene from another planet, the white tundra broken by dark patches of open water, winding rivers that hadn't yet frozen solid, and the occasional cluster of trees that marked the edge of the boreal forest to the south. Diana pressed her face to the helicopter's window, marveling at the stark beauty of the landscape, while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by its vastness and seeming emptiness. Through her headset, she could hear Mackenzie providing commentary about the landmarks they passed, pointing out the remains of a 19th century trading post, the migration routes used by caribou, and the denning areas where polar bears gave birth to their cubs during the harsh winter months. "There," Mackenzie's voice crackled through the headset as he banked the helicopter to the left. "Polar bears, 10 o'clock, about 2 kilometers. Paul and Diana strained to see through the helicopter's windows, finally spotting the cream-colored shapes moving across the white landscape. Even from their altitude of 500 feet, the bears appeared massive, their powerful builds evident as they lumbered across the tundra with the deceptively casual gait that could explode into surprising speed when circumstances demanded. "That's a female with 2 yearling cubs," Mackenzie explained, his voice carrying the respect of someone who understood exactly what they were observing. She's probably weighing around 400 pounds right now, down from her normal 600 because of the extended fasting period. The cubs are learning from her, following her movements as she searches for the earliest signs of ice formation. The sight of the bears sent a surge of adrenaline through both Paul and Diana, the reality of their situation suddenly becoming clear. They were about to be alone in the domain of these magnificent predators, protected only by their equipment, their knowledge, and their ability to make sound decisions in a landscape where mistakes could prove fatal. As they continued northwest toward their landing zone, Mackenzie pointed out additional wildlife. A small herd of caribou moving south toward their wintering grounds. Arctic foxes, whose white coats made them nearly invisible against the snow, and the dark shapes of ravens that seemed to thrive in even the harshest conditions. The helicopter's shadow raced across the ground below them, the only sign of human presence in a wilderness that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The landing zone appeared ahead of them, a slightly elevated area of relatively flat ground marked by orange cones that Thompson and his crew had placed the previous day. The Land Rover sat nearby, a dark green shape that looked almost alien against the white landscape. Mackenzie began his approach, the helicopter's rotors churning up clouds of snow and ice crystals as he settled the aircraft onto the makeshift landing pad. "Radio check every hour on the hour," Mackenzie reminded them as they climbed out of the helicopter, their boots crunching into snow that was already over a foot deep despite the early date. "First check at 1100 hours. If I don't hear from you, I start worrying. If I miss 2 consecutive checks, I'm coming back whether you want me to or not." The Land Rover started immediately, its engine having been equipped with a block heater powered by a portable generator that Thompson had left running since the previous evening. The vehicle had been modified extensively for Arctic operations, with oversized tires designed for traction on snow and ice, additional insulation to maintain cabin heat, and emergency equipment that included extra fuel, food, medical supplies, and survival gear. Paul took the driver's seat, familiarizing himself with the vehicle's controls, while Diana studied the GPS unit that would guide them through the trackless wilderness. The plan called for them to follow a rough circuit that would take them to several known bear concentration areas, while always maintaining a route back to their pickup point. As Mackenzie's helicopter disappeared to the southeast, its sound fading until only the wind remained, Paul and Diana experienced their first moment of true isolation in the Arctic wilderness. The silence was profound, broken only by the idle of the Land Rover's engine and the whisper of wind across the snow. They were alone in one of the most remote and dangerous environments on Earth, 45 minutes by helicopter from the nearest permanent shelter, surrounded by predators that could kill them with a single swipe of their massive paws. "This is it," Paul said, his voice barely above a whisper as he shifted the Land Rover into gear. "This is what we came for." Their first hour of exploration took them northeast toward a series of small lakes that Thompson had identified as prime polar bear habitat. The Land Rover handled the snow-covered terrain well, its specialized tires finding traction even when the surface seemed impassable. Diana served as navigator, following their progress on the GPS unit while also scanning the landscape ahead for any signs of wildlife. The radio check at 11 o'clock went smoothly, with Mackenzie's voice crackling clearly through the communication system. "Land Rover Base, this is Churchill 1, radio check." "Churchill 1, this is Land Rover Base," Paul responded, using the call signs Mackenzie had assigned. "All systems normal, proceeding to waypoint 2. "Copy that, Land Rover Base. Weather conditions remain stable. Next check at 1200 hours. As they continued their exploration, the landscape began to reveal its subtle variations. What had appeared uniform from the air showed itself to be a complex ecosystem of ridges, depressions, frozen ponds, and wind-sculpted snow formations. Tracks crisscrossed the snow in all directions, telling the stories of the animals that lived and hunted in this seeming wasteland. Diana spotted the first bear at 11:45, a dark shape moving slowly across a ridge, approximately half a kilometer to their north. Paul stopped the Land Rover, and they both raised their binoculars, hearts racing, as they observed their first close encounter with a wild polar bear. The bear was magnificent, a large male that Thompson would later estimate at over 800 pounds despite the reduced weight that came with extended fasting. Its fur appeared yellowish against the white snow, and its massive head swayed from side to side as it tested the air for scents that might indicate food or danger. The bear seemed aware of their presence but showed no immediate interest, continuing its methodical search for anything that might provide sustenance. "He's beautiful," Diana whispered, her voice filled with awe and respect for the magnificent predator. "I can't believe we're actually seeing this." Paul began taking photographs with the professional-grade camera equipment he had brought specifically for this trip, the telephoto lens allowing him to capture detailed images without moving closer to the bear. The animal's size was difficult to comprehend, even through the binoculars, its massive shoulders and powerful limbs indicating strength that could effortlessly overcome any human regardless of preparation or equipment. The bear eventually moved away to the north, disappearing behind a rise in the terrain, leaving Paul and Diana alone with their racing hearts and the knowledge that they had just witnessed something that few people would ever experience. The encounter had lasted only 10 minutes, but it had burned itself into their memories with an intensity that would remain long after they returned to their comfortable lives in Toronto. Their second radio check at noon revealed no problems, and Mackenzie confirmed that weather conditions remained stable with no changes expected until evening. The afternoon was progressing according to plan, with Paul and Diana growing more confident in their ability to navigate the Arctic terrain while maintaining safe distances from the wildlife they encountered. The attack began at 2:37 in the afternoon, although neither Paul nor Diana would ever be able to reconstruct the exact sequence of events that led to the most terrifying 23 minutes of their lives. They had stopped the Land Rover near a series of small hills that Thompson had identified as a favorite bear observation area, shutting off the engine to reduce noise while they watched a female bear with 2 cubs foraging approximately 300 meters away. The afternoon sun, low on the horizon even at its peak, cast long shadows across the snow, creating a pattern of light and dark that made it difficult to distinguish between natural features and potential threats. Paul had stepped outside the Land Rover to get better photographs, leaving the driver's door open while Diana remained in the passenger seat, monitoring the bear family through binoculars and providing commentary for the video camera that recorded their adventure. The male polar bear that would ultimately destroy their Land Rover and end their lives had been stalking them for over an hour, using the natural contours of the landscape to mask his approach, while his keen nose tracked their scent, and his intelligent mind assessed them as potential prey. Weighing nearly 900 pounds despite months of fasting, the bear represented the apex of polar evolution, a perfectly adapted killing machine that had survived 7 harsh Arctic winters and learned to view any potential food source as fair game. Unlike the bears they had observed from a safe distance, this male was in the late stages of what wildlife biologists called walking starvation, a condition that occurred when the normal formation of sea ice was delayed beyond the bear's ability to maintain their energy reserves. His normal diet consisted primarily of ringed seals, which he hunted by waiting at breathing holes in the sea ice or breaking into seal dens where mothers nursed their pups. With the bay ice still weeks away from forming, The bear had been surviving on nothing but his stored fat reserves, and those reserves were nearly exhausted. The bear approached from the southwest, using a shallow depression in the terrain to mask his advance until he was within 50 meters of the Land Rover. His black nose, capable of detecting scents from over a kilometer away, had been tracking the unfamiliar odors of the humans, their equipment, and the mechanical smells of the vehicle for most of the afternoon. Unlike the natural caution that typically kept polar bears away from human activity, this bear's desperation had overcome his instinctual wariness. Paul was crouched behind the open driver's door, adjusting his camera settings to compensate for the changing light conditions, when Diana's scream of terror cut through the Arctic silence like a blade. "Paul! Behind you! Bear!" The photographer's instinct to capture the moment caused Paul to raise his camera even as he turned toward the threat, the telephoto lens revealing the massive white form charging toward him at a speed that his civilized mind struggled to process. Polar bears, despite their size and seemingly lumbering gait, could reach speeds of over 30 miles per hour in short bursts. And this bear covered the final 50 meters between his concealed position and the Land Rover in less than 6 seconds. Paul's trained reflexes from years of competitive skiing and mountain climbing allowed him to dive through the open driver's door and slam it shut, just as the bear's massive form collided with the rear of the Land Rover with the force of a small automobile accident. The impact lifted the vehicle's rear wheels off the ground and spun it nearly 45 degrees, throwing Diana against the passenger door and sending equipment flying throughout the cabin. The bear's initial attack focused on the vehicle itself, his massive claws raking across the aluminum body panels and leaving gouges that penetrated completely through the metal in some places. The sound was horrifying, a combination of tearing metal and the bear's huffing vocalizations as he attempted to understand and overcome this strange obstacle that stood between him and his potential prey. "Start the car! Start the car!" Diana screamed, her voice nearly lost in the cacophony of the bear's assault on their vehicle. Paul's hands shook violently as he fumbled with the ignition key, his fine motor control compromised by the massive adrenaline dump that flooded his system in response to the mortal threat. The Land Rover's engine turned over, but failed to start. The cold weather and Paul's inexperience with the vehicle's specific starting procedures combining to create a nightmare scenario. The bear, meanwhile, had moved to the front of the vehicle and was attempting to understand the glass windshield that allowed him to see the humans inside, but prevented him from reaching them. Wildlife biologists, who would later study the attack footage from Diana's video camera, noted several behaviors that indicated the bear's extreme desperation and hunger. Normal polar bear behavior when encountering humans typically involved either avoidance or cautious investigation, but this bear showed none of the typical wariness that characterized healthy bears with adequate food sources. Instead, his actions demonstrated the single-minded focus of a predator that had identified a potential meal and was willing to overcome any obstacle to reach it. The bear reared up on his hind legs, his massive paws coming down on the Land Rover's hood with enough force to dent the heavy steel and crack the windshield. Standing on his rear legs, the bear's massive head reached nearly 9 feet above the ground, his small, dark eyes staring directly at Paul and Diana through the damaged windshield with an intelligence that was terrifying in its intensity. Paul finally managed to start the Land Rover's engine, but the bear's weight on the front of the vehicle prevented him from moving forward. The bear had positioned himself to effectively trap the vehicle while he continued his assault, demonstrating a level of tactical thinking that surprised even experienced bear researchers who later analyzed the incident. "The radio!" Diana shouted, pointing toward the communication equipment. "Call for help!" Paul grabbed the radio microphone, his voice breaking with terror as he transmitted their emergency call. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday! Churchill 1, this is Land Rover Base. We are under attack by a polar bear. Request immediate assistance. The response came immediately, Mackenzie's voice tense with concern. Land Rover Base, this is Churchill 1. What is your exact location? Are you injured? Are you safe inside the vehicle? GPS coordinates ... Paul struggled to read the numbers from the GPS unit while the bear continued his assault on their vehicle. 58 degrees, 47 minutes, 12 seconds north, 94 degrees, 21 minutes, 38 seconds west. The bear is attacking the car. We can't move. I'm launching immediately. Mackenzie's voice crackled through the radio. Estimated arrival time 45 minutes. Stay in the vehicle. Do not attempt to exit the vehicle under any circumstances. The bear's attack intensified as he realized that his prey remained frustratingly out of reach. His massive claws, each over 3 inches long and capable of opening a seal like a can opener, began working on the Land Rover's door seals and window frames. The sound of tearing rubber and bending metal filled the cabin as the bear methodically searched for a way to reach the humans inside. Diana activated the satellite emergency beacon that would transmit their exact location to rescue coordination centers across North America, ensuring that multiple agencies would respond to their crisis even if radio communication was lost. The small device, no larger than a smartphone, began broadcasting a signal that would be received by satellites and relayed to emergency responders within minutes. The bear shifted his attention to the passenger side of the vehicle, his massive weight causing the Land Rover to rock violently as he pressed against Diana's door. The reinforced glass of the side window began to show stress fractures under the pressure of his massive paws, spiderweb patterns spreading across the surface as the bear increased his efforts to break through. He's breaking the window, Diana screamed, pressing herself against Paul as the bear's claws found purchase on the window frame and began to bend the metal. The sound of creaking aluminum mixed with the bear's heavy breathing and vocalizations created a symphony of terror that would haunt both survivors for the rest of their lives. Paul attempted to drive forward, hoping to dislodge the bear from the front of the vehicle, but the animal's massive weight and strategic positioning made movement impossible. The Land Rover's all-terrain tires spun uselessly in the snow, unable to generate enough traction to overcome the 800-pound obstacle that blocked their escape. The bear's intelligence became even more apparent as he adjusted his tactics, moving to the rear of the vehicle where the spare tire was mounted. His claws found the tire's valve stem, and the hiss of escaping air indicated that he was systematically disabling their means of escape. The bear had somehow learned that these strange creatures were dependent on their mechanical aids, and he was methodically removing those advantages. "Why won't he leave us alone?" Diana sobbed. Her previous excitement about encountering polar bears transformed into absolute terror by the reality of being trapped by a desperate predator. Paul wrapped his arm around his wife while maintaining his grip on the radio microphone, providing running commentary to Mackenzie about the bear's actions and their deteriorating situation. "He's moved to the back of the car now. He's attacking the spare tire. The passenger window is cracking." Mackenzie's voice remained steady, despite the obvious stress in his tone. "I'm airborne and en route to your position. Estimated arrival 38 minutes. The bear is likely in late-stage starvation, which means he won't give up easily. Your vehicle should be strong enough to protect you until I arrive with deterrent measures." The helicopter pilot was following protocols established after previous polar bear incidents, carrying both rubber bullets and powerful firecrackers designed to drive bears away from human activity without permanently harming the animals. Mackenzie had dealt with aggressive polar bears before, including an incident 3 years earlier when a bear had trapped a research team in their temporary shelter for over 6 hours before he could safely extract them. At 3:15, exactly 38 minutes after the attack began, the bear's persistence was rewarded with a breakthrough. His claws finally managed to create a small opening in the rear window's rubber seal, allowing him to insert one massive digit and begin pulling the safety glass away from its frame. The sound of breaking glass mixed with Diana's screams as the bear's massive paw became visible inside the vehicle's cabin. Paul made a desperate decision, shifting the Land Rover into reverse and flooring the accelerator. The vehicle lurched backward, momentarily catching the bear off guard and causing him to lose his grip on the window frame. For a brief moment, it seemed as though they might escape, but the bear's reflexes proved superior to Paul's driving skills in the treacherous conditions. The bear leaped onto the Land Rover's roof with surprising agility, his massive weight causing the metal to buckle and the remaining windows to crack under the stress. Paul could feel the vehicle's suspension compressing under the additional weight as the bear positioned himself directly above them, his claws beginning to work on the sunroof that represented another potential entry point. "He's on the roof," Paul shouted into the radio. "The roof is buckling. I don't think the car can take much more." Mackenzie's response carried new urgency. "I can see you on GPS. I'm 15 minutes out. The roof should hold. These vehicles are built for extreme conditions." But the Land Rover, despite its robust construction, had never been designed to withstand a sustained assault by a 900-pound Predator equipped with 3-inch claws and the desperate hunger of a creature facing starvation. The bear's weight and focused attacks were beginning to compromise the vehicle's structural integrity, creating weak points that he was intelligent enough to identify and exploit. The sunroof's frame began to bend under the bear's assault, the reinforced glass developing the same spider web pattern of stress fractures that had appeared in the side windows. Diana pointed upward in horror as the bear's massive head became visible through the increasingly damaged glass, his black eyes staring down at them with an intensity that seemed to burn into their souls. At 3:23, the bear achieved his first significant breakthrough. His claws managed to catch the edge of the sunroof frame and tear away a section of metal and glass large enough for him to insert his massive head into the vehicle's cabin. The sight of the polar bear's massive skull appearing through their roof, his black nose testing the air, and his dark eyes focused directly on them, represented a level of terror that neither Paul nor Diana had ever imagined possible. Paul grabbed the emergency flare gun from the Land Rover's survival kit, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely maintain his grip on the device. The flare gun was designed for signaling rescue aircraft, but it represented their only potential weapon against the massive predator that was systematically breaking into their sanctuary. "Get back! Get away from us!" Paul screamed, pointing the flare gun toward the opening in the roof. The bear showed no reaction to his shouts, continuing his methodical work of enlarging the opening that would eventually allow him to reach his prey. Diana activated the Land Rover's emergency lighting system, hoping that the bright flashing lights might startle the bear or make them more visible to Mackenzie's approaching helicopter. The strobing lights reflected off the snow around them, creating a disco-like effect that seemed surreal against the backdrop of their life-or-death struggle. The radio crackled with Mackenzie's voice. "I can see your emergency lights. I'm 8 minutes out. I can see the bear on your vehicle. Prepare for noise and rotor wash when I arrive." The bear's progress in enlarging the roof opening accelerated as he found better purchase with his claws, his massive shoulders beginning to fit through the gap he had created. Paul realized with horror that the bear would soon be able to fit his entire upper body through the opening, bringing his massive jaws and front claws within easy reach of both occupants. Paul made another desperate decision, firing the flare gun through the opening in the roof. The bright red flare struck the bear in the shoulder, causing him to rear back in surprise and pain, but also enraging him further. The bear's vocalizations changed from huffing investigation to aggressive roaring as he renewed his assault on the vehicle with increased fury. The flare had achieved a brief respite, but it had also escalated the situation from a methodical investigation to an active attack. The bear now viewed the humans inside the vehicle as active threats that needed to be eliminated, not just potential prey to be captured and consumed. At 3:29, Mackenzie's helicopter appeared on the horizon, its rotors cutting through the Arctic air with a sound that Paul and Diana had never been happier to hear. The helicopter approached at maximum speed, Mackenzie pushing his aircraft to its limits in an attempt to reach the scene before the bear could complete his breakthrough into the Land Rover's cabin. The bear heard the helicopter's approach and momentarily paused his assault to assess this new threat. His massive head turned toward the sound, his ears pricked forward as he evaluated whether the approaching aircraft represented a danger to him or simply another strange phenomenon in an environment increasingly filled with unfamiliar sights and sounds. Mackenzie's tactical experience proved invaluable as he approached the scene. Rather than flying directly overhead, which might have caused the bear to intensify his attack on the trapped humans, he approached from an oblique angle that would allow him to use his rotor wash to maximum effect while positioning himself for the best possible shot with his deterrent weapons. "I'm going to try to drive him off with rotor wash first," Mackenzie's voice crackled through the radio. "Hold on, this is going to be rough." The helicopter swept low over the scene, its powerful rotors creating a hurricane of snow and ice crystals that enveloped both the bear and the Land Rover. The bear reared back from the roof as the rotor wash struck him, his massive form silhouetted against the swirling white cloud created by the helicopter's downdraft. For a moment, it seemed as though the helicopter's arrival might end the siege. The bear appeared confused and intimidated by the aircraft's noise and rotor wash, backing away from the Land Rover and looking for an escape route. But his desperate hunger overcame his natural wariness, and after only a few seconds of retreat, he returned to his assault on the vehicle with renewed determination. Mackenzie realized that gentle deterrent measures would not be sufficient to drive off a bear in the advanced stages of starvation. He positioned his helicopter for a clear shot and fired the first rubber bullet from his specialized weapon system, aiming for the bear's hindquarters in an attempt to drive him away without causing serious injury. The rubber bullet struck the bear in the right hip, causing him to spin around and roar in pain and rage. But rather than fleeing, the bear identified the helicopter as the source of the pain and began displaying aggressive behavior toward the aircraft, standing on his hind legs and swiping at the air as Mackenzie maneuvered to avoid the massive claws. "He's not backing down," Mackenzie reported. "I'm going to try a more aggressive approach." The helicopter pilot fired a series of powerful firecrackers designed to create loud explosions that would frighten wildlife away from human activity. The crackers detonated around the bear in rapid succession, creating a series of sharp reports that echoed across the Arctic landscape. The bear flinched at each explosion, but showed no inclination to retreat, his desperation apparently overriding his natural fear responses. At 3:34, the bear achieved the breakthrough he had been working toward for nearly an hour. His massive claws managed to tear away enough of the sunroof frame to allow him to insert his entire upper body into the Land Rover's cabin. Paul and Diana pressed themselves against the far side of the vehicle as the bear's massive head and shoulders filled the opening above them, his hot breath fogging the cold air inside the cabin. The bear's massive jaws, capable of crushing a seal's skull with a single bite, snapped at the air only inches from Diana's head as she screamed in absolute terror. Paul grabbed his wife and pulled her toward the driver's side of the vehicle, desperately trying to keep distance between them and the massive predator that was now halfway inside their sanctuary. Mackenzie made a split-second decision that would later be debated by wildlife officials and aviation authorities. Realizing that standard deterrent measures were insufficient to drive off the starving bear, He positioned his helicopter directly above the scene and began using his aircraft's landing skids to physically strike the bear and force him away from the Land Rover. The helicopter's skids struck the bear across the shoulders, delivering a blow that would have killed a smaller animal, but only served to further enrage the massive predator. The bear turned his attention toward the helicopter, swiping at the aircraft with his massive claws and coming dangerously close to striking the main rotor assembly. "I can't get a clear shot!" Mackenzie shouted over the radio. "He's too close to your vehicle! If I miss, I could hit you!" Paul realized that their situation had become hopeless. The bear was now far enough inside the vehicle to reach them with his massive claws, and Mackenzie's helicopter was unable to use lethal force without risking the lives of the very people he was trying to save. The Land Rover's cabin, which had seemed like an impregnable fortress an hour earlier, had become a trap that held them within easy reach of one of nature's most efficient predators. The bear's massive paw swiped toward Diana, his claws passing so close to her face that she could feel the displacement of air as they swept past. Paul grabbed the survival knife from the emergency kit, knowing that the small blade would be useless against the massive predator, but unable to remain passive while his wife faced death. At 3:36, exactly 59 minutes after the initial attack began, the bear finally managed to grab Diana's jacket with his massive claws. The sound of tearing fabric mixed with her screams as the bear began pulling her toward the opening in the roof, his massive strength easily overcoming her desperate attempts to resist. Paul stabbed at the bear's massive paw with the survival knife, the small blade penetrating the thick hide but causing no significant damage to the massive predator. The bear's attention turned briefly toward Paul, giving Diana a momentary respite, but placing her husband in immediate mortal danger. Mackenzie made his final desperate gambit, positioning his helicopter so that its main rotor was only feet above the bear's head and using the aircraft's maximum power to create a downdraft that might force the predator away from his victims. The helicopter's rotors churned the air with such violence that the entire scene disappeared in a whirlwind of snow and ice crystals. But through the chaos, Mackenzie could still hear the sounds of the struggle inside the damaged Land Rover. The bear's massive jaws closed on Paul's left arm as he attempted to stab the animal again, the predator's teeth penetrating through the thick Arctic clothing and into the flesh beneath. Paul's scream of pain and terror was audible even over the helicopter's rotors as the bear began to crush the bones in his forearm with the pressure of his massive jaws. Diana grabbed the emergency radio, her voice breaking with hysteria as she transmitted what she believed would be her final message. "This is Land Rover Base. The bear is inside the car. He's killing us. Please help us. Please." Mackenzie's military training took over as he realized that conventional rescue attempts had failed. He positioned his helicopter for a landing approximately 50 meters from the Land Rover, knowing that his only chance of saving the trapped couple was to land and use his emergency rifle to kill the bear before it could finish its attack. The helicopter touched down with Mackenzie already unbuckling his safety harness and reaching for the rifle that he carried for exactly this type of emergency. The weapon was a .38 Winchester Magnum, powerful enough to stop a charging polar bear with a well-placed shot, but Mackenzie would have to get close enough for an accurate shot without becoming the bear's next victim. As Mackenzie ran toward the scene with his rifle ready, he could see the bear's massive form half inside the Land Rover, his powerful muscles working as he attempted to drag Paul through the opening in the roof. Diana was pressed against the driver's side door, her hands pressed to her mouth as she watched her husband disappearing into the bear's massive jaws. Mackenzie reached a position approximately 20 meters from the Land Rover and raised his rifle, trying to find a shot that would kill the bear without risking the lives of the people he was trying to save. The bear's massive head was clearly visible through his rifle scope, but Paul's body was directly in the line of fire, making a safe shot impossible. "Diana!" Mackenzie shouted. "Can you hear me? I need you to get as low as possible." Diana heard the pilot's voice and dropped to the floor of the Land Rover, pressing herself against the pedals and dashboard in an attempt to give Mackenzie a clear shot at the bear. The predator was now focused entirely on Paul, his massive jaws working to crush the bones in the banker's arm while his claws raked across his chest and shoulders. At 3:39, Mackenzie fired his first shot, aiming for the bear's head, but striking him in the neck instead. The powerful bullet tore through the bear's thick hide and muscle, causing massive trauma, but failing to kill the animal immediately. The bear released Paul and turned toward this new threat, blood streaming from his wound as he prepared to defend himself against the approaching human. Paul collapsed inside the Land Rover, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle and his jacket soaked with blood from the deep claw marks across his chest and shoulders. Diana crawled toward her husband, pressing her hands against his wounds in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, while Mackenzie prepared for his second shot. The wounded bear charged toward Mackenzie with surprising speed despite his injury, covering the 20 meters between them in less than 4 seconds. Mackenzie's military training served him well as he maintained his composure and fired his second shot when the bear was only 10 meters away, this time striking the massive predator directly in the center of his forehead. The .338 caliber bullet penetrated the bear's skull and brain, killing him instantly and sending his massive body tumbling forward through the snow until he came to rest only 3 meters from Mackenzie's position. The sudden silence that followed the gunshot was profound, broken only by Diana's sobs and the distant sound of the helicopter's idling rotors. Mackenzie immediately ran to the Land Rover, where he found Paul unconscious and losing blood rapidly from his multiple wounds. Diana was in shock but appeared physically unharmed, her hands still pressed against her husband's injuries as she whispered his name over and over. "Diana, I need you to listen to me," Mackenzie said, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos they had just survived. "Paul is badly hurt, but he's alive. I need to get him to a hospital immediately. Can you walk? Are you injured?" Diana nodded numbly, her green eyes wide with shock as she struggled to process what had just happened. Mackenzie quickly assessed Paul's injuries, noting the obvious fractures in his left arm and the deep puncture wounds from the bear's claws. The banker was breathing but unconscious, his face pale from blood loss and shock. Mackenzie activated his emergency medical kit, applying pressure bandages to Paul's worst wounds and immobilizing his injured arm with an inflatable splint. The helicopter pilot had been trained as a paramedic during his military service, and his quick actions probably saved Paul's life during the critical minutes after the attack. "We need to get him to Churchill immediately," Mackenzie told Diana as he prepared Paul for transport. "The hospital there has a trauma team standing by. Can you help me get him to the helicopter?" Diana nodded and helped Mackenzie carefully move Paul from the destroyed Land Rover to the helicopter, where they secured him on a stretcher that Mackenzie had retrieved from his aircraft's emergency equipment. The flight to Churchill took 38 minutes, with Mackenzie maintaining radio contact with the hospital's emergency room throughout the journey. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency room physician at Churchill Regional Hospital, had been alerted to the incoming trauma case and had assembled her team in preparation for Paul's arrival. Dr. Chen, a veteran of 15 years in emergency medicine who had come to Churchill specifically to treat the unique medical emergencies that occurred in the Arctic, had dealt with polar bear attacks before and understood the specific types of injuries they typically caused. Paul was rushed directly into the hospital's trauma bay, where Dr. Chen and her team began the process of stabilizing his condition and assessing the full extent of his injuries. X-rays revealed multiple fractures in his left forearm, including a compound fracture of the radius that would require immediate surgical intervention. The bear's claws had created deep puncture wounds across his chest and shoulders, missing vital organs but causing significant soft tissue damage. Diana was treated for shock and minor injuries in the hospital's emergency room, while Paul underwent emergency surgery to repair his fractured arm and clean his puncture wounds. The surgical team, led by Dr. Michael Kovac, an orthopedic surgeon who had moved to Churchill after completing his residency in Winnipeg, worked for over 4 hours to reconstruct Paul's damaged forearm and ensure that the bear's claws had not caused any internal organ damage. The attack had lasted exactly 1 hour and 2 minutes from the bear's initial charge to Mackenzie's successful shot, but its impact would continue for months and years as Paul recovered from his physical injuries and both survivors dealt with the psychological trauma of their encounter with one of nature's apex predators. News of the attack spread quickly through Churchill's small community and then to the outside world through social media and traditional news outlets. The dramatic helicopter rescue and the destruction of the Land Rover created a story that captured international attention, with news crews arriving in Churchill within days to cover the aftermath of what wildlife officials described as one of the most serious polar bear attacks in recent memory. Thompson, the bear guide who had warned Paul and Diana about the increasing aggression of the local bear population, arrived at the hospital the morning after the attack to check on the couple's condition and to provide his professional assessment of what had occurred. Thompson had seen the aftermath of polar bear attacks before, but the systematic nature of this bear's assault on the Land Rover and his apparent intelligence in trapping the vehicle demonstrated a level of desperation that concerned wildlife officials. This wasn't normal bear behavior, Thompson told reporters who had gathered outside the hospital. A healthy bear with adequate food sources would never have sustained an attack for over an hour. This animal was in the final stages of starvation, and that made him extremely dangerous. We're seeing more of this type of behavior as climate change delays the formation of sea ice and extends the bear's fasting period. The Canadian Wildlife Service launched an immediate investigation into the attack, led by Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a polar bear specialist with over 20 years of experience studying the species. Dr. Walsh's preliminary findings indicated that the attacking bear had been in poor physical condition, weighing approximately 200 pounds less than normal for a male of his size and age. This bear was essentially starving, Dr. Walsh explained during a press conference held 3 days after the attack. The delayed formation of sea ice this year has created an extremely stressful situation for the entire polar bear population in this region. When bears reach this level of desperation, they will attack virtually anything they perceive as a potential food source, including humans. The investigation also revealed that the bear had been observed in the area for several weeks prior to the attack, displaying increasingly bold behavior as his condition deteriorated. Local residents had reported sightings of a large male bear approaching the outskirts of Churchill on multiple occasions, behavior that was unusual but not unprecedented during years when ice formation was delayed. Mackenzie became something of a local hero for his role in saving Paul and Diana's lives, but the experienced pilot was haunted by the knowledge that he had been forced to kill a magnificent animal that was simply following its instincts in an environment increasingly affected by human activity. The helicopter pilot had grown up in the Arctic and understood the complex relationship between humans and wildlife in one of the world's last remaining wilderness areas. That bear didn't want to die, Mackenzie told friends at the local tavern the evening after the attack. He was just trying to survive in a world that's changing faster than he could adapt. It's a tragedy for everyone involved. Paul's recovery proved to be long and difficult, requiring multiple surgeries to repair the damage to his left arm and extensive physical therapy to regain full use of his injured limb. The psychological impact of the attack proved even more challenging to overcome, with both Paul and Diana suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder that required months of counseling and treatment. Diana experienced panic attacks whenever she heard sudden loud noises, her mind immediately returning to the sound of the bear's claws raking across the Land Rover's metal body. Paul struggled with nightmares that replayed the moment when the bear's massive jaws closed on his arm, the memory of crushing pressure and tearing flesh remaining vivid long after his physical wounds had healed. The couple's expensive Arctic adventure, which had cost them nearly $30,000 and been planned for over 18 months, had become a nightmare that would affect every aspect of their lives for years to come. Their marriage, which had been strong before the attack, was strained by the shared trauma and the different ways they each processed their brush with death. The destroyed Land Rover was eventually recovered from the attack site and transported to Winnipeg for analysis by insurance investigators and wildlife officials. The vehicle's damage told the story of the bear's systematic assault, with claw marks and bite marks covering virtually every surface. The roof had been partially torn away, and the passenger side had been severely damaged by the bear's attempts to reach the humans inside. Insurance company officials estimated the total damage to the Land Rover at over 80,000 Canadian dollars, making it a complete loss despite the vehicle's robust construction. The insurance company's investigation confirmed that the attack had occurred in a legitimate wildlife viewing area, and that Paul and Diana had followed all recommended safety procedures, ensuring that their claim would be processed without dispute. The legal implications of the attack proved complex, with questions arising about liability for the incident and the appropriateness of allowing tourists to enter polar bear habitat without professional guides. Environmental groups used the attack to highlight the increasing dangers posed by climate change and its impact on polar bear behavior, while tourism industry representatives argued that the incident was an unprecedented event that should not be used to restrict access to one of the world's premier wildlife viewing destinations. The tour company that had arranged Paul and Diana's self-guided expedition faced intense scrutiny from both government regulators and the media, with critics arguing that allowing inexperienced tourists to drive through polar bear habitat without professional supervision was inherently dangerous. The company defended its safety procedures, pointing out that similar self-guided tours had been conducted safely for over 10 years without serious incident. Thompson's employer, Arctic Adventure Tours, implemented new safety protocols following the attack, including mandatory satellite tracking for all self-guided expeditions and reduced duration limits for solo vehicle tours. The company also invested in additional emergency equipment and enhanced communication systems designed to provide faster response times in case of future incidents. The polar bear that Mackenzie had been forced to kill was examined by wildlife veterinarians from the University of Manitoba, who confirmed that the animal had been in the advanced stages of starvation. The bear's stomach was completely empty, and his body fat reserves had been reduced to less than 5% of his normal levels, indicating that he had been surviving without food for an extended period. Dr. Stephen Morrison, the veterinary pathologist who conducted the examination, noted that the bear showed signs of chronic stress and malnutrition that had likely affected his behavior and judgment. This animal was essentially dying of starvation, Dr. Morrison explained in his official report. His attack on the humans represented a desperate attempt to obtain food, not normal predatory behavior. The incident contributed to a growing body of evidence that climate change was creating increasingly dangerous conditions for both polar bears and the humans who lived and worked in the Arctic. Environmental scientists pointed to the attack as an example of the unintended consequences of global warming, which was disrupting the natural patterns that had governed Arctic ecosystems for thousands of years. 6 months after the attack, Paul returned to his job as an investment banker in Toronto, though his injured arm limited his ability to perform certain tasks and served as a constant reminder of his encounter with the polar bear. Diana took an extended leave of absence from her marketing position, using the time to undergo intensive therapy and to work with a writer on a book about their experience. The couple's book, titled Surviving the Arctic: Our Encounter with a Starving Polar Bear, was published 18 months after the attack and became a bestseller in Canada. The book provided a detailed account of their experience, while also examining the broader issues of climate change and human-wildlife conflict in the Arctic. Diana's vivid descriptions of the attack and its aftermath helped readers understand the psychological impact of surviving a life-threatening wildlife encounter. "The bear wasn't just trying to kill us," she wrote in one particularly powerful passage. "He was fighting for his own survival in a world that was no longer providing what he needed to live. In a strange way, we were both victims of the same changing environment." Paul's perspective focused more on the practical aspects of survival and the split-second decisions that had meant the difference between life and death. "When you're facing a 900-pound predator with 3-inch claws, all your civilized training becomes irrelevant," he wrote. "You discover parts of yourself that you never knew existed, and you learn that the line between life and death can be measured in seconds." The book's publication led to speaking engagements across North America, with Paul and Diana sharing their story at environmental conferences, outdoor recreation events, and educational institutions. Their message focused on the need for better understanding of wildlife behavior and the importance of respecting the power of nature, even in an age of advanced technology and safety equipment. Mackenzie continued flying rescue missions in the Arctic, but the polar bear incident had changed his perspective on the relationship between humans and wildlife in the region. He became an advocate for stricter safety protocols for tourist activities in polar bear habitat, and worked with local authorities to develop better emergency response procedures for wildlife encounters. "That attack didn't have to happen," Mackenzie told a gathering of helicopter pilots at a safety conference in Winnipeg. "If we had better monitoring of bear populations and more restrictions on human activity during critical periods, we could prevent most of these incidents. The bears aren't the enemy here. They're just trying to survive in a world that's changing too fast for them to adapt." Thompson, the bear guide whose warnings had proven prophetic, used the incident to advocate for more conservative approaches to wildlife tourism in the Arctic. He worked with government officials to develop new guidelines that would restrict human access to polar bear habitat during periods when the animals were under severe environmental stress. "We've been lucky for too many years," Thompson explained to fellow guides during a professional development workshop. "Climate change is making the bears more unpredictable and more dangerous. We need to adjust our practices to reflect this new reality, even if it means disappointing some tourists who want to get closer to the wildlife." The attack site was marked with a memorial plaque installed by the Canadian Wildlife Service, serving as a reminder of the incident and a warning to future visitors about the potential dangers of Arctic wildlife encounters. The plaque's inscription read, "In memory of the polar bear that died here on November 7th, 2024, and in recognition of the survival of Paul and Diana Reynolds. May this place remind us of our responsibility to coexist respectfully with the wildlife that calls the Arctic home." Churchill's tourism industry initially suffered from negative publicity following the attack, with some visitors cancelling planned trips out of concern for their safety. However, the community's response to the incident, including enhanced safety measures and more comprehensive educational programs, eventually restored confidence among wildlife enthusiasts seeking authentic Arctic experiences. Local businesses adapted their operations to address visitors' concerns about wildlife safety, with several companies investing in enhanced communication equipment and additional emergency training for their staff. The Churchill Chamber of Commerce developed new educational materials that helped tourists understand both the incredible beauty of polar bear encounters and the very real risks involved in visiting their habitat. Dr. Chen, the emergency room physician who had treated Paul's injuries, used the case to advocate for enhanced trauma care capabilities in remote Arctic communities. The incident demonstrated the importance of having specialized medical expertise available in regions where wildlife attacks and other emergency situations were more likely to occur. Polar bear attacks create very specific types of injuries, Dr. Chen explained during a medical conference focused on wilderness medicine. The crushing force of their jaws and the penetrating wounds from their claws require immediate surgical intervention that isn't always available in remote locations. We need to ensure that communities in polar bear habitat have the medical resources necessary to treat these types of trauma. The incident also led to improvements in emergency communication systems throughout the Hudson Bay region, with government agencies investing in additional satellite relay stations and enhanced coordination between rescue agencies. The 45-minute response time to reach Paul and Diana was considered excellent under the circumstances, but officials recognized that even faster response times might be necessary to save lives in future incidents. Wildlife officials used the attack to support their arguments for increased funding for polar bear research and monitoring programs. The incident demonstrated the need for better understanding of how climate change was affecting bear behavior and the importance of tracking individual animals that might pose increased risks to human safety. We need to know which bears are becoming desperate before they attack, Dr. Walsh explained during a presentation to government funding agencies. Better monitoring and tracking systems could allow us to identify problem animals and take preventive action before they encounter humans. The attack's impact extended beyond the immediate participants to affect the broader conversation about climate change and its effects on Arctic ecosystems. Environmental groups used Paul and Diana's story to illustrate the human consequences of global warming, arguing that the incident represented just one example of how changing environmental conditions were creating new dangers for both wildlife and humans. Policymakers in both Canada and the United States cited the incident when discussing the need for more aggressive action to address climate change and its effects on Arctic regions. The attack provided a compelling human story that helped illustrate the abstract concepts of environmental change and species adaptation in terms that ordinary citizens could understand and relate to. 2 years after the attack, Paul and Diana returned to Churchill for the first time since their ordeal, participating in a ceremony to dedicate the memorial plaque at the attack site. The return journey was emotionally difficult for both survivors, but they felt it was important to face their trauma and to honor the memory of the polar bear that had died in the incident. "Coming back here was one of the hardest things I've ever done," Diana said during the dedication ceremony, "but we needed to acknowledge that this place represents both the beauty and the danger of the natural world. The bear that attacked us wasn't evil. He was just hungry and desperate, trying to survive in conditions that were beyond his control." Paul's perspective on the return visit focused on the changes that had occurred in the 2 years since their attack. "The ice is forming even later now than it was when we were attacked," he observed. "The bears are under even more stress, which means the potential for more incidents like ours is increasing. We need to find better ways to coexist with these magnificent animals before it's too late for both species." The memorial ceremony was attended by many of the people who had been involved in the rescue and recovery efforts, including Mackenzie, Thompson, Dr. Chen, and several wildlife officials who had investigated the incident. The gathering provided an opportunity for all participants to process their experiences and to discuss lessons learned from the tragedy. Mackenzie used the occasion to announce his decision to retire from emergency rescue flying, explaining that the polar bear incident had convinced him that the risks associated with Arctic aviation were becoming too great for him to continue. "I've been flying in the Arctic for over 20 years," he told the assembled group. "I've seen how much conditions have changed, and I don't think the environment is as predictable as it used to be." Thompson announced that he was transitioning from active guiding to a new role as a safety consultant, working with tourism companies and government agencies to develop better protocols for wildlife encounters. "The attack taught us that our traditional approaches to managing human-wildlife interactions aren't adequate for the changing conditions we're facing," he explained. Dr. Chen had used her experience treating Paul's injuries to develop new treatment protocols for polar bear attack victims, which had been adopted by emergency medical services throughout the Arctic. Her research had also contributed to improvements in trauma care training for medical personnel working in remote locations. The wildlife officials who had investigated the incident reported that polar bear attacks had become more frequent in the 2 years since Paul and Diana's encounter, with 3 additional serious incidents occurring in the Hudson Bay region. All of the recent attacks had involved bears in poor physical condition, supporting the theory that climate change was creating more dangerous conditions for both bears and humans. "We're seeing a pattern of increasing aggression and boldness among polar bears throughout their range," Dr. Walsh reported. "The traditional warnings and deterrent measures that worked in the past are becoming less effective as the bears become more desperate." The dedication ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for the polar bear that had died in the incident, followed by readings from Paul and Diana's book and speeches by several wildlife conservation leaders. The event was covered by national media outlets and helped maintain public awareness of the ongoing challenges facing Arctic ecosystems and the communities that depended on them. In the years that followed, Paul and Diana became prominent advocates for both wildlife conservation and climate change action, using their story to illustrate the personal consequences of environmental degradation. Their speaking engagements and media appearances helped educate the public about the complex relationships between human activity, climate change, and wildlife behavior. The Land Rover that had been destroyed in the attack was eventually donated to a museum in Winnipeg, where it served as part of an exhibit about human-wildlife conflict in the Arctic. The damaged vehicle, with its torn roof and claw marks still visible, provided a powerful visual reminder of the incident and helped visitors understand the reality of surviving a polar bear attack. The exhibit also included portions of the video footage that Diana had recorded during the attack, along with audio recordings of the radio communications between Paul and Mackenzie during the rescue operation. The multimedia presentation allowed visitors to experience the terror and confusion of the incident, while also learning about the broader environmental issues that had contributed to the bear's aggressive behavior. Educational institutions across North America began using Paul and Diana's story as a case study in environmental science courses, examining how climate change was affecting wildlife behavior and creating new challenges for human-wildlife coexistence. The incident provided a compelling example of how abstract environmental concepts could have very real and immediate consequences for both animals and humans. The attack's legacy extended beyond its immediate participants to influence policy decisions and research priorities throughout the Arctic region. Government agencies increased funding for polar bear research and monitoring programs, while tourism operators implemented more conservative safety protocols for wildlife viewing activities. The incident also contributed to broader discussions about the ethics of wildlife tourism and the responsibility of humans to minimize their impact on wild animal populations. Some environmental groups argued that all tourism in polar bear habitat should be suspended until the effects of climate change on bear behavior were better understood, while industry representatives maintained that responsible tourism could coexist with wildlife conservation if proper precautions were taken. 5 years after the attack, Paul and Diana published a follow-up book examining the long-term consequences of their encounter and the changes that had occurred in the Arctic since their ordeal. The second book, titled After the Bear: Climate Change and the Future of Arctic Wildlife, expanded their focus beyond their personal experience to examine the broader environmental issues affecting the region. The follow-up book included interviews with scientists, wildlife managers, and indigenous community leaders who had observed changes in polar bear behavior over the course of their careers. The consensus among these experts was that the conditions that had led to Paul and Diana's attack were becoming more common, and that similar incidents were likely to increase in frequency unless significant action was taken to address climate change. "Our attack was a wake-up call," Diana wrote in the conclusion of their second book. "It showed us that the changes occurring in the Arctic aren't just affecting the bears. They're affecting everyone who lives, works, or visits in these regions. We can't continue to treat climate change as an abstract future problem when its effects are already creating life and death situations for both wildlife and humans." Paul's contributions to the second book focused on the economic implications of climate change in the Arctic, examining how environmental degradation was affecting tourism, research, and other economic activities in the region. His background in finance allowed him to analyze the costs of climate change adaptation and the economic benefits of taking action to address environmental problems before they created more serious crises. "The cost of preventing climate change is significant," Paul wrote, "but the cost of dealing with its consequences is much higher. Our attack was just one incident, but it required hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical treatment, emergency response, and investigation costs. Multiply that by the increasing number of similar incidents occurring throughout the Arctic, and the economic argument for climate action becomes overwhelming." The couple's advocacy work eventually led to invitations to speak at international climate conferences, where their personal story helped illustrate the human face of environmental change. Their presentations were particularly effective with audiences who might otherwise view climate change as a distant or abstract concern. When people hear about polar bears losing their habitat due to melting sea ice, it's easy to think of it as a wildlife issue that doesn't affect humans, Diana explained during a presentation at a United Nations climate conference. "Our story shows that human and wildlife welfare are interconnected in ways that we're only beginning to understand." Their international advocacy work also brought them into contact with indigenous communities in the Arctic who had been observing changes in polar bear behavior for much longer than scientists had been studying the issue. These conversations provided Paul and Diana with new perspectives on their experience and helped them understand how their encounter fit into broader patterns of environmental change. "The elders in our community have been warning about these changes for decades," explained Mary Kusugak, an Inuit leader from Nunavut who spoke at several events with Paul and Diana. "The bears are behaving differently because their world is changing in ways that are too fast for them to adapt. Your attack was just one example of what happens when we don't listen to these warnings." The collaboration between Paul and Diana and indigenous communities helped bridge the gap between scientific research and traditional knowledge, creating a more comprehensive understanding of how climate change was affecting Arctic ecosystems. Their work contributed to improved communication between researchers and indigenous communities and helped ensure that traditional knowledge was incorporated into wildlife management decisions. 10 years after the attack, Paul and Diana had become recognized experts on human-wildlife conflict in the Arctic, consulted by government agencies, research institutions, and conservation organizations around the world. Their transformation from victims of a wildlife attack to advocates for environmental protection represented one of the most positive outcomes of their traumatic experience. The polar bear that had attacked them was never forgotten, becoming a symbol of the broader challenges facing Arctic wildlife in an era of rapid environmental change. His death had served as a catalyst for important conversations about climate change, wildlife conservation, and human responsibility for protecting the natural world. The attack site near Hudson Bay remained a place of pilgrimage for researchers, conservationists, and others interested in understanding the complex relationships between humans and wildlife in the Arctic. The memorial plaque installed at the location continued to serve as a reminder of the incident and a warning about the potential consequences of ignoring environmental change. The lessons learned from Paul and Diana's encounter with the desperate polar bear extended far beyond the boundaries of the Arctic, influencing wildlife management practices and climate change policies around the world. Their story demonstrated that the effects of environmental degradation were not limited to remote wilderness areas, but could have immediate and life-threatening consequences for anyone who ventured into the natural world. As climate change continued to accelerate and its effects became more pronounced throughout the Arctic and beyond, the significance of their encounter only grew. The polar bear that had attacked them on that November day in 2024 had become an unwitting messenger, carrying a warning about the future that awaited both wildlife and humans if significant action was not taken to address the environmental challenges facing the planet. The legacy of their survival and the death of the polar bear that had threatened them would continue to influence conversations about environmental protection, wildlife conservation, and human responsibility for generations to come. Their story served as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring environmental change and an inspiring example of how personal trauma could be transformed into positive action for the benefit of both humans and wildlife. In the end, the attack that had lasted just over an hour had created ripple effects that would continue for decades, touching the lives of countless people and animals and contributing to a growing understanding of the interconnectedness of all life on a planet facing unprecedented environmental challenges. The polar bear that had destroyed their vehicle and nearly killed them had ultimately saved countless lives by serving as a catalyst for awareness, action, and change. The next stories. The Watchers of Broken Creek. Dr. Sarah Chen had always prided herself on her rational mind, but standing at the edge of the Broken Creek Wilderness Research Station at dawn on August 12, 2024, she felt an inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the Montana morning air. The mist clung to the valley floor like smoke from some ancient funeral pyre, and somewhere in the distance, a sound that might have been wind through the pines carried an undertone that made her spine crawl. She adjusted her field journal against her chest and tried to shake the feeling that something was watching her from the tree line. The research station sat nestled in a bowl-shaped valley 30 miles southeast of Glacier National Park, accessible only by a winding gravel road that took 2 hours to navigate even in good weather. Built in 1987 by the University of Montana's Wildlife Biology Department, the compound consisted of 4 weathered log cabins arranged around a central clearing with a generator shed, equipment storage, and a small communications tower that looked like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the sky. The nearest town, Whitefish, might as well have been on another planet for all the good it would do them if something went wrong. Sarah's team had arrived 3 days earlier to begin what was supposed to be a routine 6-week study of grizzly bear foraging patterns in preparation for the upcoming salmon run. The research was part of a larger conservation effort, funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation, aimed at understanding how climate change was affecting traditional bear behaviors. What they had found instead was something that defied easy explanation, something that turned their scientific instruments into divining rods, pointing toward a mystery that seemed to grow deeper with each passing hour. Dr. Marcus Webb, the project's lead researcher and Sarah's mentor for the past 4 years, emerged from the main cabin with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. At 62, Marcus possessed the kind of weathered competence that came from decades of fieldwork in some of the most remote places on Earth. His grey beard was perpetually dusted with ash from his pipe, and his pale blue eyes held the patient intelligence of someone who had learned to read the subtleties of the natural world, like others read books. This morning, however, those eyes carried a troubled expression that Sarah had never seen before. "Sleep any better?" Marcus asked, handing her one of the mugs. The coffee was strong enough to dissolve paint, the way he always made it in the field. But Sarah welcomed the bitter warmth. "Not really," she admitted. "I kept hearing things, movement outside the cabin, branches breaking. But every time I looked out the window, there was nothing there." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the wall of lodgepole pines that surrounded their camp on 3 sides. Elena and David reported the same thing. "Something's got the local wildlife spooked. Did you notice yesterday how quiet the birds were? No squirrel chatter, no chipmunk activity. Even the insects seemed subdued." Sarah had noticed. In her 7 years of fieldwork, she had learned to read the forest's moods through the behavior of its smallest inhabitants. The absence of normal forest sounds was like the silence that falls over a library when someone important enters the room. Except this silence felt charged with an entirely different kind of anticipation. Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared in the doorway of the communications cabin, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that somehow still managed to look elegant. As the team's technology specialist and data analyst, Elena was responsible for maintaining their connection to the outside world and processing the information from their network of trail cameras and motion sensors. At 34, she possessed a PhD in applied mathematics from Stanford and a level of technological expertise that made their remote research possible. This morning, her usually confident demeanor seemed strained. "We've got a problem," Elena announced without preamble. "I've been reviewing the footage from our camera grid and the patterns are..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Unprecedented." The team gathered in the communications cabin, a cramped space dominated by banks of electronic equipment that hummed and blinked like the nerve center of a small spacecraft. Elena had arranged dozens of trail camera images on her laptop screen in a complex grid pattern that resembled a chessboard mid-game. Each image was time-stamped and bore the identifier of its source camera. "Look at this sequence," Eleanor said, pointing to a row of images taken over the past 72 hours. "Camera 12, positioned at the north end of the valley near the old mining trail. We have a large adult grizzly, probably male based on size, appearing consistently every 6 hours. Not randomly, every 6 hours, almost to the minute." David Kim, their graduate research assistant, leaned closer to the screen. At 26, David brought an infectious enthusiasm to the project that sometimes masked his impressive academic credentials. He had completed his master's thesis on predator behavioral patterns at the University of Washington, focusing specifically on the cognitive abilities of large mammals. His expertise in animal psychology made him an invaluable member of the team, though his youthful optimism sometimes clashed with the realities of wilderness research. "That's unusual," David admitted. "Bears don't typically maintain such rigid schedules unless they're following a very specific food source. What's the terrain like around Camera 12? Marcus pulled out a detailed topographical map and spread it across Elena's work table. The map showed their valley in intricate detail, with elevation lines marking the steep slopes that rose on all sides like the walls of a natural amphitheater. Their camp sat at approximately 4,200 feet elevation, with the surrounding peaks reaching as high as 7,800 feet. Broken Creek itself wound through the center of the valley, fed by snowmelt and mountain springs, creating a ribbon of life that supported a diverse ecosystem. Camera 12 is here, Marcus said, pointing to a spot marked with a red dot. About a quarter-mile north of camp, positioned along what used to be a pack trail for the old copper mine. The terrain is fairly open there, mixed forest with good sight lines. No obvious food sources that would explain regular visits. Eleanor clicked through to another series of images. Here's where it gets interesting. Cameras 15, 18, and 22 all show the same bear, or one very similar, following a clockwise pattern around the valley. The timing suggests it's conducting some kind of systematic patrol. Sarah felt her coffee grow cold in her hands as she studied the images. The bear in question was indeed massive, with the distinctive shoulder hump and dished face profile that marked it as a mature grizzly. Its dark brown coat appeared almost black in the infrared photography, giving it a spectral quality that made her unconsciously step back from the screen. "How many different bears are we tracking in total?" she asked. Elena's fingers flew across her keyboard, bringing up a comprehensive data analysis. Based on size, coloration, and distinctive markings, I count at least 7 different individuals. But here's what's really strange. She overlaid the movement patterns on the topographical map, creating a web of colored lines that showed each bear's travel routes. They're not behaving independently. Look at these patterns. The overlay revealed something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The 7 bears appeared to be moving in a coordinated fashion, their routes intersecting at specific points around the valley's perimeter. It was as if they were taking turns maintaining surveillance over the research station, each animal responsible for a specific sector of the surrounding terrain. "Bears don't coordinate like this," David said quietly. "They're solitary animals outside of mating season and salmon runs. This kind of organized behavior is more typical of pack hunters like wolves." Marcus removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture Sarah recognized as his way of buying time to think through complex problems. "In 40 years of studying bear behavior, I've never seen anything like this. The question is whether we're witnessing some kind of natural adaptation or if something else is influencing their behavior." Elena pulled up another set of data, this time showing electromagnetic readings from their environmental sensors. "I've been monitoring background radiation, electromagnetic fields, seismic activity, anything that might explain unusual animal behavior. Everything reads normal, well within expected parameters for this region." The silence that followed was broken by a sound that made them all freeze. It came from somewhere beyond the north wall of the valley, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to carry for miles through the thin mountain air. The sound was unmistakably that of a large bear, but it held a quality that Sarah had never heard before, a kind of deliberate modulation that seemed almost communicative. "Was that," David began. "A call," Marcus finished. "And listen." They waited in absolute silence for nearly 30 seconds before the call was answered. This time it came from the south, a similar rumbling vocalization, but with subtle differences in pitch and duration. A few moments later, a third call echoed from somewhere to the west, followed by responses from the east and southeast. "They're communicating," Elena whispered, "coordinating." Sarah moved to the window and peered out at the forest. The morning mist had largely dissipated, leaving the pine-covered slopes clearly visible in the growing daylight. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even, but she could not shake the feeling that they were being observed from multiple vantage points. The sensation was so strong that she found herself unconsciously cataloguing potential escape routes and defensive positions. "We need to establish exactly how many bears we're dealing with and document their behavioral patterns," Marcus said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when making difficult decisions. "But we also need to consider whether continuing this research is safe." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the team's wildlife veterinarian and emergency medical specialist, chose that moment to arrive from her morning perimeter walk. At 41, Jennifer brought a combination of medical expertise and practical outdoor experience that made her indispensable for remote research projects. She had served as a combat medic in Afghanistan before completing her veterinary degree, and her calm competence in crisis situations had saved more than one research expedition from disaster. We've got fresh sign everywhere," Jennifer announced as she entered the cabin. "Massive tracks, claw marks on trees, scat deposits that look deliberately placed, and the strangest thing, I found what looks like a kill site about half a mile downstream, but whatever died there was completely consumed, nothing left but bloodstains and disturbed earth." She unloaded a collection of plaster casts from her backpack, setting them carefully on Elena's work table. The track casts showed enormous paw prints, some measuring nearly a foot in length with claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe pads. The size and definition of the tracks suggested bears weighing well over 600 pounds, creatures of exceptional size, even for this region known for producing massive grizzlies. These tracks are distributed in a pattern that suggests systematic territorial marking, Jennifer continued. Whatever's happening here, these animals are establishing some kind of claim to this valley. And based on the freshness of the sign, I'd say this behavior intensified right around the time we arrived. The implications of her words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah found herself thinking about the isolation of their position, the long drive back to civilization, the unreliable cell phone coverage that made communication with the outside world sporadic at best. They had provisions for 6 weeks, but their extraction wasn't scheduled until September 22nd. If something went wrong, if they needed help, they would be largely on their own. "I think we should implement enhanced security protocols immediately," Jennifer suggested. "Secure all food storage, establish a buddy system for any movement outside the main camp area, and set up a rotation schedule for perimeter watches." Elena's computer chimed with an incoming message from the university's central communication system. She read the message quickly, her expression growing more troubled with each line. "Weather Service is predicting a major storm front moving in from the northwest. Possible early snow at our elevation, with winds up to 60 miles per hour. The system is expected to arrive sometime tomorrow evening and could last for several days." Sarah looked around at her colleagues and realized they were all thinking the same thing. A major storm would cut off their already tenuous connection to the outside world, potentially making extraction impossible for an unknown period. At the same time, it would force them into even closer quarters with whatever was watching them from the surrounding forest. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as the team implemented their new security protocols and prepared for the approaching weather. Sarah and David worked together to secure the equipment storage shed, moving sensitive instruments inside the main cabins and double-checking the tie-downs on everything that couldn't be relocated. Eleanor focused on backing up their research data and ensuring their communication equipment would survive any power outages, while Jennifer and Marcus conducted a thorough inventory of their medical supplies and emergency equipment. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah found herself assigned to the first watch shift, positioned at a table by the main cabin's largest window with a clear view of the northern approach. The forest beyond the camp perimeter appeared deceptively peaceful in the golden light of late summer, but she had learned not to trust appearances in this place. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat. Every movement of branches in the breeze looked like something large and dangerous shifting through the trees. Her watch partner was David, who had positioned himself at the eastern window with a pair of high-powered binoculars and a detailed notebook for recording observations. They had agreed to maintain silence except for essential communications, both to avoid alerting any watching animals to their awareness and to ensure they could hear any subtle sounds from the surrounding forest. At 6:23 p.m., David tapped her shoulder gently, and pointed toward a stand of aspens about 200 yards from camp. Sarah raised her own binoculars and focused on the spot he had indicated. For a moment, she saw nothing unusual, just the pale trunks of the aspen trees and the darker shapes of pine beyond. Then something moved, a massive shadow that seemed to detach itself from the tree line and take a single step forward before becoming motionless again. The bear was enormous, easily the largest Sarah had ever seen. Its brown coat appeared almost black in the fading light, and its shoulders rose above the surrounding brush like a small mountain. What struck her most forcefully was the deliberate nature of its positioning. The animal had not simply wandered into view, it had moved to a spot where it would be clearly visible from the camp, almost as if it wanted to be seen. They watched in silence for nearly 10 minutes as the bear remained absolutely motionless, its massive head turned directly toward their cabin. Then, with the same deliberate movement it had used to reveal itself, the creature stepped backward into the forest and disappeared. "Did you get the feeling it was studying us?" David whispered. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The encounter had lasted only minutes, but it had fundamentally changed her understanding of their situation. They were not simply researchers observing wild animals in their natural habitat. They had become subjects of observation themselves, studied by intelligences that were far more sophisticated than anything she had been trained to expect. As darkness fell over the valley, the team gathered in the main cabin for dinner and a strategy session. The meal was simple: canned soup and crackers heated on their propane stove, but the act of sharing food provided a comforting reminder of human civilization in the growing wilderness of their circumstances. "I've been thinking about the behavioral patterns we've documented," Marcus said between spoonfuls of soup. "In my experience, when predators begin exhibiting coordinated territorial behavior around human presence, it usually indicates one of two things. Either they're protecting a critical resource we've unknowingly threatened, or they're evaluating us as potential prey." Jennifer set down her spoon and leaned back in her chair. "From a tactical perspective, our position here is almost indefensible. We're surrounded by high ground, our escape routes are limited, and our communication with the outside world is unreliable. If these animals decide to become actively aggressive, our options are going to be severely limited." Elena had been unusually quiet during the meal, but now she spoke up. "There's something else I need to show you. I've been analyzing the audio recordings from our surveillance equipment, and I've found something that doesn't make sense." She moved to her laptop and opened an audio analysis program that displayed sound waves as visual patterns on the screen. "Listen to this recording from last night, between 2 and 3 a.m. The speakers filled with the ambient sounds of the forest at night, wind through trees, the distant call of an owl, the soft rushing of Broken Creek. But underneath these natural sounds, Sarah could hear something else, a series of low-frequency rumbles that seemed to follow a distinct pattern. Those vocalizations are coming from at least 5 different locations around the valley," Eleanor explained, "and they're not random. Watch the pattern analysis." The computer program highlighted the repeating elements in the sound sequence, revealing a structure that was disturbingly reminiscent of language. The vocalizations followed consistent patterns of pitch, duration, and spacing that suggested they carried specific information. "Are you saying these bears are talking to each other?" David asked. "I'm saying they're communicating in ways that go far beyond anything documented in the scientific literature," Eleanor replied. "And based on the frequency and complexity of these exchanges, I'd estimate they're sharing quite detailed information." The cabin fell silent, except for the soft hiss of the propane heater and the distant sound of wind beginning to pick up outside. Sarah found herself thinking about the evolutionary pressures that might produce such sophisticated communication in a supposedly solitary species. Bears were undeniably intelligent animals, but what they were documenting suggested cognitive abilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and social organization. We need to consider the possibility that we're dealing with something unprecedented, Marcus said finally. A population of bears that has developed advanced social behaviors in response to some unknown environmental pressure. The question is whether we're in a position to study this phenomenon safely or whether we need to retreat and return with better resources. Before anyone could respond, the lights went out. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of Elena's laptop screen and the red indicator lights on their electronic equipment. The sound of the generator outside had stopped completely, leaving them in a silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. Jennifer was the first to move, her military training overriding the natural impulse to remain frozen. She located her flashlight and swept the beam around the cabin, checking that everyone was accounted for and uninjured. "Generator failure," she announced. "Could be mechanical, could be weather-related, or..." She didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood the implication. The generator was housed in a locked shed, approximately 50 feet from the main cabin, accessible only by crossing open ground that would leave them exposed to observation from the surrounding forest. "I'll check it out," Marcus volunteered, but Jennifer immediately shook her head. "No one goes outside alone. If we're going to investigate, we go in pairs with full communication protocols." Elena's laptop battery provided enough light for them to organize their emergency response. They had backup power systems for their essential equipment, but the main generator provided heat, hot water, and the ability to run their communications array. Without it, they would be reduced to survival mode within a matter of hours. Sarah found herself paired with Jennifer for the generator inspection, while Marcus and David remained in the cabin to monitor their communication equipment and maintain watch. Elena would coordinate between the two groups using handheld radios, assuming the generator failure hadn't affected their communications systems. The night air outside the cabin was noticeably colder than it had been at sunset, and Sarah could smell the approaching storm in the wind that rustled through the pine needles overhead. Their flashlight beams carved narrow tunnels through the darkness, revealing little beyond the immediate path to the generator shed. The silence was so complete that their footsteps on the gravel seemed unnaturally loud. The generator shed was a simple wooden structure with a metal roof and a single door secured by a heavy padlock. Jennifer examined the lock carefully before opening it, checking for any signs of tampering or damage. The lock appeared undisturbed, but when she pulled open the door, both women immediately noticed something wrong. The generator itself appeared undamaged, but the fuel line had been disconnected. Not broken or damaged by weather or mechanical failure, but deliberately disconnected, with the coupling unscrewed and set carefully aside on the shed's workbench. "Someone or something turned off our power," Jennifer said quietly into her radio. "The fuel line has been manually disconnected." Marcus's voice crackled back through the speaker. "Are you certain it wasn't mechanical failure?" "Positive. The coupling was unscrewed and placed on the workbench. This was intentional." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as the implications sank in. Something with sufficient manual dexterity and technical understanding had deliberately disabled their generator. Bears were known to be remarkably intelligent and capable of solving complex problems, but this level of technical manipulation suggested cognitive abilities that existed outside the realm of established animal behavior. Jennifer reconnected the fuel line and attempted to restart the generator. The engine turned over immediately, filling the night air with its familiar rumbling sound and restoring power to the camp. But as they prepared to return to the main cabin, Sarah noticed something that made her blood freeze. In the soft earth beside the generator shed, clearly illuminated by their flashlight beams, were fresh bear tracks. But these weren't the usual four-pad prints they had been finding around the camp. These tracks showed clear evidence of the animal having reared up on its hind legs to reach the generator shed's door handle, and the front paw prints showed an unusual pattern that suggested the bear had been manipulating objects with its claws. "Jennifer," Sarah whispered, pointing at the tracks. The veterinarian examined the prints carefully, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she studied the evidence. "These tracks show fine motor control," she said finally, "the kind of dexterity you'd expect from a primate, not a bear. And look at this." She pointed to a series of smaller impressions near the shed's doorframe. "These look like tool marks, as if something was using a stick or similar object to manipulate the door mechanism." They returned to the main cabin in silence, but Sarah could not stop thinking about the implications of what they had discovered. Tool use among bears was documented but rare, usually limited to using rocks to dig or sticks to scratch. What they had found suggested a level of technological adaptation that challenged basic assumptions about the cognitive boundaries between humans and other species. The team spent the next hour documenting their findings and debating their next course of action. Elena's weather monitoring equipment confirmed that the approaching storm would bring significant snowfall to their elevation, potentially making road access impossible for several days. At the same time, the evidence of deliberate technological manipulation by their bear watchers suggested they were dealing with something far more complex than routine wildlife behavior. "I think we're past the point where we can pretend this is normal animal behavior," Jennifer said during their strategy session. "The coordination, the communication patterns, the tool use. We're documenting something that doesn't fit any established behavioral models." David had been unusually quiet, but now he looked up from the notes he had been taking. "There's something else to consider. If these animals are as intelligent as they appear to be, they've probably figured out that we're documenting their behavior. Our cameras, our equipment, our obvious observation activities, they know they're being studied." The cabin's main window faced north toward the tree line, where they had observed the large bear earlier in the evening. As if summoned by David's words, a massive shape moved into view at the edge of their vision, then another and another. By the time they had all moved to the window, 7 enormous bears were visible at various points along the forest edge. They stood motionless in the artificial light cast by their restored generator, their dark forms creating a semicircle of observation that encompassed the northern, eastern, and western approaches to the camp. "They're not hiding anymore," Marcus observed quietly. "Whatever evaluation period they've been conducting, I think they've reached a conclusion." The bears remained visible for nearly an hour, maintaining their vigil in absolute stillness while the research team watched from behind the cabin's windows. Sarah found herself cataloguing the individual animals, noting their relative sizes and positions, trying to understand the hierarchy or organization that governed their behavior. The largest bear, the one they had first observed that afternoon, occupied the central position directly north of the camp. The others were arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate formation, with smaller individuals positioned at the flanks and intermediate-sized animals filling the gaps between. At exactly 11:47 p.m., as if responding to some invisible signal, all 7 bears turned and disappeared into the forest simultaneously. The coordination of their withdrawal was so precise that it seemed almost choreographed, leaving the research team staring out at empty forest and questioning whether they had actually witnessed what their eyes insisted they had seen. "We need to make a decision," Marcus said as they prepared for bed. "We can stay and continue documenting these behaviors, potentially making one of the most significant discoveries in animal behavior research in decades. Or we can acknowledge that we're in over our heads and attempt to extract ourselves before the weather makes that impossible." Elena checked their communication equipment one final time before retiring to her cabin. I've sent a preliminary report to the university, along with our GPS coordinates and current status. If we decide to request early extraction, we need to make that call before the storm arrives tomorrow evening. Sarah lay awake in her bunk for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest outside her cabin. The normal nighttime chorus of insects and small mammals remained absent, replaced by an occasional low rumble that might have been wind through the trees or something far more deliberate. Every time she began to drift towards sleep, she would hear a sound that brought her back to full alertness, a branch snapping, gravel crunching, the soft whisper of something large moving through the underbrush just beyond the thin walls of her shelter. Sometime after 3 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely and moved to her cabin's single window. The view faced east toward the valley's rim, where the first hint of dawn would eventually appear. In the darkness between the cabin and the tree line, she could make out shapes that might have been boulders or fallen logs, but which seemed to shift slightly whenever she wasn't looking directly at them. The sensation of being watched was so intense that she found herself unconsciously holding her breath, as if the act of breathing might somehow alert whatever was observing her to her awareness of its presence. She remained at the window until the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of grey, and only then did she see one of the shapes near the tree line rise to its full height and lumber away into the forest. Dawn on August 13th brought low clouds and a steadily dropping barometric pressure that made the approaching storm feel almost tangible. Sarah emerged from her cabin to find the rest of the team already gathered around the main cabin's entrance, their expressions suggesting they had all spent equally restless nights. "I've been monitoring our perimeter cameras all night," Elena reported. "We had consistent movement around the camp, from approximately midnight until just before dawn. At least 12 different heat signatures, some of them significantly larger than anything we've recorded before. Jennifer had prepared coffee and a simple breakfast, but none of them seemed particularly interested in food. The atmosphere in the camp felt charged with tension, as if they were all waiting for something to happen, but weren't sure what form it would take. I think we need to accept that normal research protocols don't apply to this situation," Marcus said, as they gathered around Eleanor's laptop to review the overnight footage. "We're dealing with animals that are clearly aware of our presence and our activities, and that have demonstrated capabilities that go beyond anything in the scientific literature." The trail camera footage from the previous night was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The thermal imaging revealed large shapes moving in coordinated patterns around the camp's perimeter, with individuals appearing to take specific positions and maintain them for extended periods before rotating to new locations. The behavior was systematic, purposeful, and undeniably intelligent. "Look at this sequence from camera 8, Elena said, highlighting a series of images taken between 2:15 and 2:45 a.m. This individual spent 30 minutes in a position that provides a clear view of our communications antenna. It's not foraging, it's not marking territory, it's conducting surveillance." David studied the images intently, his academic training warring with the evidence before his eyes. "The positioning is too deliberate to be coincidental. They're gathering intelligence about our capabilities and resources." A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin's windows, and Sarah noticed that the trees outside were beginning to sway more dramatically as the storm front approached. Elena's weather monitoring equipment showed steadily dropping pressure and increasing wind speeds, with the first snowflakes expected to begin falling within the next few hours. "Decision time," Jennifer announced. "If we're going to request extraction, we need to do it now. Once this storm hits, we could be looking at several days of impossible road conditions." The team fell silent as they considered their options. Scientific discovery of this magnitude could define careers and advance human understanding of animal intelligence in ways that had previously been unimaginable. At the same time, they were clearly dealing with a situation that had moved beyond the boundaries of normal research safety protocols. Marcus made the decision with the kind of quiet authority that had guided Sarah through dozens of challenging field situations. We stay, but we implement full emergency protocols and maintain constant communication with the university. At the first sign that our safety is genuinely compromised, we activate our emergency beacon and request immediate helicopter extraction. Elena nodded and began setting up their emergency communication systems, while Jennifer inventoried their survival supplies and medical equipment. David and Sarah worked together to secure the camp's perimeter, checking that all food storage was properly bear-proofed and that their equipment was protected against both weather and potential interference. As they worked, Sarah found herself thinking about the intelligence they were documenting. The bears' behavior suggested not just individual cleverness, but collective problem-solving abilities that implied some form of cultural transmission of knowledge. If bears in this region had developed such sophisticated social behaviors, it raised profound questions about the cognitive evolution of large mammals and the potential for non-human intelligence to emerge in forms that science had never anticipated. The first snowflakes began falling at 2:17 p.m., large, wet flakes that clung to the pine needles and quickly began accumulating on the ground. Within an hour, the landscape had transformed from late summer to early winter, with visibility dropping dramatically as the snowfall intensified. The wind picked up steadily throughout the afternoon, creating a white noise background that would mask the sounds of any approaching animals. Elena's communication with the university became increasingly difficult as the storm intensified, with static and interference making radio contact sporadic at best. Their last clear transmission was logged at 4:43 p.m., confirming their position and status, but providing no opportunity to request extraction, even if they had wanted to. As darkness fell, the team gathered in the main cabin for what they all understood might be a critical night. The storm outside had developed into a full blizzard, with wind speeds approaching 50 miles per hour and snowfall heavy enough to accumulate several inches on the cabin's roof. The isolation they had felt before was now complete. They were cut off from the outside world by weather and surrounded by intelligent predators whose intentions remained unknown. "I've been thinking about the evolutionary pressures that might produce this kind of behavior," David said, as they settled in for the evening. "Bears are typically solitary because their food resources don't support large social groups. But what if these animals have found a way to coordinate their hunting that makes group living advantageous?" Jennifer looked up from her equipment check. "You mean cooperative hunting? Bears don't hunt cooperatively." "Bears we know about don't hunt cooperatively," David corrected. "But we're clearly dealing with a population that has developed behaviors that exist outside normal parameters. If they've learned to coordinate their activities for territorial control, it's not a huge leap to imagine they might coordinate for other purposes as well." The implications of his words settled over the cabin like a shroud. Sarah found herself thinking about their position. 5 humans trapped in a wooden structure, surrounded by an unknown number of highly intelligent predators, cut off from communication with the outside world by a blizzard that could last for days. At 9:23 p.m., their deliberations were interrupted by a sound that made them all freeze. It came from directly overhead, a scraping, scratching noise that suggested something large was moving across the cabin's roof. The sound was methodical, deliberate, as if whatever was above them was conducting a careful examination of the structure. Jennifer motioned for silence and pointed toward the ceiling. They could track the movement of whatever was above them by following the sounds of its progress across the roof. The creature moved from the northern edge of the cabin toward the center, paused for several minutes directly above their heads, then continued toward the southern edge, where the roof met the wall. The sounds stopped abruptly, leaving them listening to nothing but the wind and their own breathing. Then, after a silence that lasted nearly 5 minutes, they heard a new sound, the deliberate rhythmic scratching of claws against wood coming from the cabin's eastern wall just below the roofline. Elena grabbed her laptop and pulled up the feed from their external cameras, but the blizzard had reduced visibility to virtually zero. The thermal imaging sensors were detecting heat signatures near the cabin, but the storm's interference made it impossible to determine exact numbers or locations. "It's testing the structure," Jennifer said quietly, "checking for weak points." Marcus moved to the cabin's gun cabinet and removed a large caliber rifle, checking the magazine and chambering a round. Sarah had never seen him handle a weapon during their years of working together, and the sight of the rifle in his hands somehow made their situation feel more real and more desperate. "Are we really considering shooting bears that are protected by federal law?" David asked. "We're considering staying alive," Marcus replied grimly, "and I suspect that the legal implications of our actions are going to be the least of our concerns." The scratching continued for another 10 minutes, moving systematically around the cabin's perimeter. Whatever was outside was conducting a thorough structural assessment, testing the strength of walls, windows, and doors. The methodical nature of the examination was more disturbing than outright aggression would have been, suggesting a level of planning and forethought that implied they were dealing with something that understood both their vulnerabilities and its own capabilities. When the sounds finally stopped, the silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the blood rushing in her ears. They waited for over an hour, taking turns at different windows, but saw nothing except the swirling snow and the occasional glimpse of trees bending in the wind. "I don't think it's gone," Elena said finally. "The thermal sensors are still picking up heat signatures, but they're stationary now. Whatever's out there is just waiting." The long night passed in shifts, with 2 team members maintaining watch at all times, while the others attempted to rest. Sarah found sleep impossible, even during her designated rest periods. Every sound from outside, and there were many, brought her instantly alert, straining to distinguish between wind-blown debris and the deliberate movements of large animals. At 3:17 a.m., during David's watch shift, the lights went out again. This time, however, the generator continued running, its steady rumble clearly audible through the storm. The power failure was localized to the cabin itself, suggesting that something had interfered with the electrical connections between the generator and their living quarters. Jennifer and Elena volunteered to investigate, but before they could leave the cabin, they heard a sound that made the decision for them. It was the unmistakable noise of the generator being shut down, followed by the sudden silence that meant their power source had been completely disabled. "They've figured out our technology," Marcus said in the darkness. "They know how to cut our power, and they know we'll have to come outside to restore it." Elena's laptop battery provided their only source of light as they considered their options. The temperature inside the cabin was already beginning to drop without the electric heaters, and their propane supply was insufficient to heat the structure through a multi-day storm. Without power, their communication equipment would last only as long as their battery backup systems, and their food preservation would become a serious issue within 24 hours. "It's a siege," Jennifer observed. "They're forcing us to expose ourselves by eliminating our ability to remain safely inside." Sarah found herself thinking about the intelligence required to develop such a strategy. The bears had observed their technology, understood its importance to their survival, and developed a plan to systematically disable their advantages. The level of abstract thinking and long-term planning implied cognitive abilities that rivaled those of humans. "We have to assume they're monitoring our communications," Eleanor said, as she attempted to re-establish radio contact with the university. If they understand our technology well enough to disable it, they probably understand that we use it to communicate with the outside world. The static-filled response from the university's emergency monitoring station was barely audible through the storm interference, but Elena managed to convey their basic situation before the signal was lost entirely. Whether their message had been received clearly enough to prompt a rescue response was impossible to determine. As dawn approached on August 14th, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind had intensified, and the snow accumulation outside their windows suggested they would be dealing with several feet of new snowfall. Even if they could restore power to their communication equipment, helicopter extraction would be impossible in these conditions. The first indication that their situation had deteriorated further came when David spotted movement through the cabin's eastern window. Despite the limited visibility, he could see what appeared to be multiple large shapes moving systematically through the forest around their camp. The shapes appeared and disappeared in the swirling snow, but their movements suggested coordinated positioning rather than random foraging. "I count at least 6, possibly more," David reported. "They're maintaining positions at regular intervals around the camp's perimeter." Elena's laptop showed that their external camera systems were still functioning on battery power, but the thermal imaging was increasingly unreliable due to storm interference. What they could see suggested that the bears had established a complete encirclement of their position, with individuals positioned to monitor all possible escape routes. "We're completely surrounded," Elena confirmed, "and based on the heat signatures, some of these animals are significantly larger than anything we've documented before." The psychological pressure of their situation was beginning to affect the team in different ways. David had become obsessively focused on documenting their observations, filling page after page with detailed notes about bear behavior and potential evolutionary implications. Elena remained glued to her equipment, constantly attempting to re-establish communication or find some technological solution to their predicament. Jennifer methodically checked and rechecked their survival supplies, while Marcus sat quietly with his rifle, staring out at the storm with the patient alertness of someone who had learned to recognize genuine danger. Sarah found herself thinking about the bears' perspective on their situation. From an animal's point of view, the research team represented an intrusion into territory that the bears had claimed. Their presence, their equipment, their obvious study activities would all be perceived as potential threats. The question was whether the bears' response would remain territorial or evolve into something more directly aggressive. At 11:45 a.m., they received their answer. The first direct challenge came not as an attack, but as a deliberate test of their defenses. Something began systematically rattling the cabin's doors and windows, testing latches and examining the strength of their barriers. The sounds were methodical and purposeful, like a burglar examining a house for points of entry. Jennifer positioned herself at the front door with her sidearm drawn, while Marcus covered the rear entrance with his rifle. Sarah and Elena monitored the windows, and David continued documenting everything they observed. The testing continued for nearly an hour, with whatever was outside demonstrating an intimate understanding of human construction methods and security measures. "It knows exactly what it's doing," Jennifer observed as she listened to the careful manipulation of the door latch. "This isn't random exploration, it's conducting a security assessment." When the testing finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow more ominous than the sounds had been. Sarah realized that whatever was outside had completed its evaluation and reached some kind of conclusion about their vulnerability. The question was what action would follow that assessment. The answer came at 2:17 p.m. when they heard the unmistakable sound of their equipment storage shed being forcibly opened. The building was located approximately 100 feet from the main cabin. well within sight of their windows, but too far away for them to intervene effectively. Through the storm, they could see massive shapes moving around the storage building, systematically destroying their research equipment and emergency supplies. "They're eliminating our resources," Marcus said grimly, "making sure we can't sustain ourselves here long term." Eleanor attempted to document the destruction through her camera equipment, but the storm limited their visual recording to brief glimpses of enormous shapes methodically dismantling years of expensive research infrastructure. The sound of metal being bent and torn, wood splintering, and equipment being smashed continued for over an hour. When the destruction finally ended, the bears had eliminated most of their backup supplies and all of their emergency signaling equipment. Their satellite phone, emergency radio beacon, and weather monitoring systems had all been systematically destroyed. They were now limited to whatever supplies they had stored in the main cabin and whatever battery power remained in Elena's laptop. "We're being systematically isolated," Jennifer said, as they assessed their remaining resources. "They've cut our power, destroyed our communications, eliminated our backup supplies, and established a perimeter that prevents escape. This is a coordinated siege using principles that you'd normally associate with military tactics." The afternoon passed in tense monitoring of their situation. The bears maintained their positions around the camp, but made no further aggressive moves. Elena's battery-powered equipment showed consistent heat signatures at multiple points around their perimeter, confirming that they remained completely surrounded. As evening approached, Sarah found herself thinking about the evolutionary timeline that might have produced such sophisticated behavior. Bears were among the most intelligent of the large mammals, but the level of coordination and strategic thinking they were witnessing suggested something that went beyond normal animal cognition. Either they were observing a remarkable example of rapid behavioral adaptation, or they had encountered a population that had been developing these capabilities over a much longer period than anyone had realized. "I keep thinking about tool use," David said during their evening strategy session. "We've documented these animals using tools to manipulate our technology. But tool use typically develops in response to specific environmental pressures. What kind of pressure would lead bears to develop such sophisticated technological understanding?" Elena looked up from her equipment. "Human encroachment. If these animals have been dealing with human presence in their territory for generations, they might have evolved specific adaptations for understanding and countering human technology." The implications were staggering. If the bears had developed their capabilities in response to human activity, then what they were witnessing represented a form of evolutionary arms race between human technology and animal adaptation. The bears had learned to understand and defeat human defensive measures, suggesting a level of observational learning and cultural transmission that existed outside the realm of documented animal behavior. Night fell early due to the storm clouds, and with it came a new phase of their siege. The bears began what could only be described as psychological warfare, producing a coordinated series of vocalizations that echoed through the valley despite the wind and snow. The calls followed complex patterns that suggested they were sharing detailed information about the research team's position, resources, and vulnerabilities. "They're communicating about us," Elena said, as she analyzed the audio patterns on her laptop. "The frequency and complexity of these vocalizations suggest they're coordinating their next phase of action." Sarah positioned herself at the cabin's main window and tried to peer through the storm toward the forest. Despite the limited visibility, she could occasionally glimpse large shapes moving between the trees, always just at the edge of perception. The sensation of being watched by multiple intelligent observers was so intense that she found herself unconsciously backing away from the windows. At 10:33 p.m., the psychological pressure escalated dramatically. The bears began a systematic campaign of intimidation, taking turns approaching the cabin and testing its defenses. First one, then another would emerge from the storm, approach within a few feet of the walls, and begin scratching, clawing, or pushing against the structure. Each probe was brief but deliberate, designed to test both the physical integrity of their shelter and the psychological resilience of its occupants. "They're wearing us down," Jennifer observed as she watched Marcus pace back and forth with his rifle. "Keeping us in a constant state of alert, preventing us from resting, gradually exhausting our ability to respond effectively." The attacks continued throughout the night, never escalating to the point where lethal force would be clearly justified, but maintaining enough pressure to prevent sleep or relaxation. By dawn on August 15th, the entire team was operating on nervous energy and adrenaline, their decision-making abilities compromised by fatigue and stress. The storm finally began to weaken during the early morning hours, with the wind dropping and the snowfall becoming more intermittent. For the first time in 2 days, they could see more than a few yards beyond their windows, and what they saw confirmed their worst fears. The bears had used the cover of the storm to establish a sophisticated siege perimeter around their camp. Large individuals were positioned at strategic points that controlled all possible escape routes, while smaller animals maintained mobile patrols that would detect any attempt to break out of the encirclement. The level of tactical sophistication was unlike anything documented in animal behavior research. "We're dealing with a level of intelligence that approaches human capability," Marcus said as they surveyed the situation. "These animals have developed military-style tactics for controlling territory and managing threats." Elena's laptop showed that their remaining battery power would last perhaps another 12 hours. After that, they would be limited to whatever they could observe directly and whatever supplies they had managed to preserve in the main cabin. Their food would last perhaps another week, but without power for heating, they would face serious cold weather survival challenges within days. "I think we need to consider the possibility that these animals don't intend to kill us directly," Jennifer said during their morning strategy session. "They're smart enough to understand that our deaths would bring investigation and retaliation. Instead, they're trying to force us to leave their territory voluntarily." Sarah looked around at her colleagues and realized they were all thinking the same thing. They had 3 basic options: attempt to fight their way out of the siege, wait for rescue that might never come, or find some way to communicate with their captors and negotiate a peaceful resolution. "Bears are capable of recognizing submissive behavior," David said quietly. "If we could somehow communicate our willingness to leave their territory without threat or retaliation, they might allow us to depart peacefully." The idea of attempting to communicate with their besiegers was both fascinating and terrifying. It implied treating the bears as rational agents capable of understanding complex negotiations rather than simple predators responding to basic instincts. If David was right, they might be able to resolve their situation through diplomacy rather than force. "How would we even attempt such communication?" Elena asked. Marcus had been quietly considering the problem. "In my experience, bears respond to consistent, non-threatening behavior patterns. If we could demonstrate our willingness to leave through our actions rather than our words, they might accept that as sufficient resolution." The team spent the morning developing a plan that would have seemed absurd under normal circumstances, but made sense given their situation. They would attempt to communicate their peaceful intentions through deliberate, observable actions designed to demonstrate their willingness to abandon the research site and leave the bears' territory undisturbed. First, they would systematically pack their remaining equipment and supplies in a manner that would be clearly visible to their observers. Then, they would disable any remaining recording devices and data collection systems, demonstrating that their research activities had ceased. Finally, they would position themselves near their vehicle and wait for the bears to either permit their departure or clarify their intentions through more direct action. The plan required them to expose themselves outside the relative safety of the cabin, making them vulnerable to direct attack if their assessment of the situation was incorrect. But remaining in the cabin would ultimately lead to the same outcome through cold, starvation, or eventual structural failure as the bears continued their siege. "If we're wrong about their intelligence," Jennifer said, as they prepared to implement their plan, "we're going to find out very quickly." At 1:15 p.m., with the storm reduced to light snow flurries and visibility improved to several hundred yards, they opened the cabin door and began their demonstration. Marcus emerged first, his rifle clearly visible but carried in a non-threatening position. The others followed, moving slowly and deliberately while making no sudden gestures that might be interpreted as aggressive. The response was immediate and unmistakable. Every bear visible around the camp's perimeter turned to face them, maintaining their positions but clearly focused on the human activity. Sarah could feel the weight of multiple intelligent gazes, evaluating their every movement, assessing their intentions and potential threat level. They spent the next hour systematically packing their vehicle, making sure that their actions were clearly visible to their observers. Elena deliberately shut down and packed her recording equipment, while David collected and secured their research materials. Jennifer and Marcus loaded their supplies, and Sarah made a point of removing the batteries from their remaining trail cameras. Throughout the process, the bears maintained their positions but made no aggressive moves. Sarah found herself thinking about the cognitive processes required for the animals to understand what they were observing. The bears had to recognize the significance of the packing behavior, understand that it indicated preparation for departure, and make a collective decision about whether to permit or prevent that departure. When they had finished loading their vehicle, the team gathered near the driver's side door and waited. They had done everything possible to communicate their peaceful intentions and their willingness to abandon the research site. What happened next would depend on whether the bears accepted their demonstration as sufficient resolution to the territorial dispute. For several minutes, nothing changed. The bears remained in their positions, and the humans stood beside their vehicle, neither side making any aggressive moves. Then slowly and deliberately, the largest bear began walking toward them. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as the massive animal approached. It was even larger than she had realized, easily weighing over 700 pounds, with a shoulder height that would bring its head level with her own when it reached them. Its movements were calm and purposeful, showing no signs of aggressive intent, but demonstrating clearly that it could reach them long before they could retreat to safety. The bear stopped approximately 20 feet away and regarded them with an intelligence that was unmistakably conscious and evaluative. For nearly 5 minutes, humans and bears studied each other in silence, each side trying to read the intentions and capabilities of the other. Then, without any apparent signal or communication, the bear turned and walked back toward the forest. As it departed, the other bears visible around the camp's perimeter began to withdraw as well, moving away from their siege positions in the same coordinated manner they had used to establish them. Marcus started the vehicle's engine, and they began their slow drive out of the valley. As they traveled the winding access road, Sarah could see bears positioned at intervals along their route, watching their departure but making no move to interfere. The escort continued until they reached the main highway, where the last bear observer disappeared into the forest as they turned toward civilization. They drove in silence for nearly an hour before anyone spoke. The magnitude of what they had experienced was still sinking in, and none of them were quite ready to begin the process of analysis and explanation that would occupy the rest of their careers. "We're going to have a very difficult time convincing anyone that what we experienced actually happened," Elena said finally. Sarah nodded, thinking about the scientific community's likely reaction to their reports. Without clear photographic evidence or detailed recordings, their account would sound like the product of isolation-induced paranoia rather than objective scientific observation. "The important thing is that we documented what we could," Marcus replied. "Even if we can't prove every aspect of what we experienced, we have enough evidence to support further investigation." David had been unusually quiet during their drive, but now he looked up from the notes he had been reviewing. "I keep thinking about the implications for our understanding of animal intelligence. If we're right about what we observed, it means we've been fundamentally underestimating the cognitive capabilities of large mammals." The conversation continued as they drove back to Whitefish, each team member trying to process the experience and consider its implications for their respective fields of study. Sarah found herself thinking about the bears they had left behind, wondering whether their departure had truly resolved the territorial dispute or simply postponed a more serious confrontation. Their arrival at the university created an immediate stir among the faculty and administration. News of their early return and reports of unusual bear behavior quickly spread through the wildlife biology department, generating intense interest and skepticism in equal measure. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the department chair and an internationally recognized expert on large mammal behavior, listened to their preliminary report with the kind of professional skepticism that Sarah had expected. The team's account of coordinated bear behavior, technological manipulation, and sophisticated communication challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence that had guided research for decades. "You're describing cognitive abilities that would place these animals in the same category as the great apes," Dr. Reynolds said after reviewing their initial documentation. "The level of abstract thinking, planning, and social coordination you're reporting is simply unprecedented in bear research." Elena's surviving video footage provided some support for their claims, showing clear examples of coordinated movement and surveillance behavior. The audio recordings of complex vocalizations offered additional evidence of sophisticated communication, though the storm interference limited their quality and clarity. "The problem is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," Dr. Reynolds continued. "What you've documented is certainly unusual, but it's not sufficient to support the revolutionary conclusions you're suggesting." Sarah understood the skepticism, but found it frustrating given what they had experienced. The scientific method required reproducible evidence and peer review, but the intelligence they had encountered seemed specifically designed to avoid detection and documentation by human observers. "We need to organize a follow-up expedition," Marcus said during their debriefing session. "A larger team with better equipment and more sophisticated monitoring capabilities." Dr. Reynolds nodded but looked troubled. "Given what you've reported, I'm not sure we can ethically send another research team into that area without better understanding what we're dealing with. If these animals are as intelligent and potentially dangerous as you suggest, we may need to involve federal wildlife authorities before proceeding." The mention of federal involvement made Sarah realize that their experience was about to become much more complicated. Reports of unusually intelligent and potentially dangerous wildlife would attract attention from agencies beyond the academic community, including those responsible for public safety and national security. Over the following weeks, the team worked to compile a comprehensive report of their observations and experiences. Elena processed the surviving data from their monitoring equipment. David analyzed the behavioral patterns they had documented. Jennifer prepared medical and safety assessments, and Marcus coordinated with university administration and external agencies. The report they eventually submitted was unlike anything in the scientific literature. It documented animal behavior that challenged basic assumptions about intelligence, consciousness, and the cognitive boundaries between humans and other species. The implications were profound enough to affect fields ranging from evolutionary biology to cognitive science to conservation policy. The response from the scientific community was predictably divided. Some researchers expressed fascination with the possibilities suggested by the team's observations, while others dismissed their claims as the product of stress, isolation, and misinterpretation of normal animal behavior. Dr. James Mitchell from the Smithsonian's National Zoo provided one of the more thoughtful responses to their report. While the specific behaviors described are indeed unprecedented, we should remember that animal intelligence research is still in its infancy. We're constantly discovering new examples of cognitive abilities that we previously thought were unique to humans. The debate that followed publication of their preliminary findings would continue for years, with researchers divided between those who accepted the possibility of advanced bear intelligence and those who insisted that more conventional explanations must exist for the observed behaviors. 3 months after their return, Sarah received permission to lead a limited follow-up expedition to the Broken Creek area. The team would be smaller and more focused, with enhanced safety protocols and sophisticated monitoring equipment designed to document animal behavior while minimizing human intrusion into the bear's territory. As she prepared for the return trip, Sarah found herself thinking about the intelligence they had encountered and the implications of contact between human and non-human consciousness. The bears had demonstrated cognitive abilities that demanded recognition as a form of intelligence deserving of respect and consideration. The question that haunted her was whether humanity was prepared to acknowledge and interact with forms of intelligence that had evolved independently of human civilization. The bears of Broken Creek had developed capabilities that rivaled human cognitive abilities, but they had done so in pursuit of goals and values that remained largely incomprehensible to human observers. Standing at the edge of the Broken Creek Valley for the second time, Sarah felt the same inexplicable chill she had experienced months earlier. The forest appeared peaceful in the autumn light, with golden aspen leaves contrasting against the dark green of the pine slopes. But she could not shake the feeling that they were being observed from the shadows, evaluated by intelligences that had learned to see humanity as just another factor in the complex ecosystem of survival and territorial control. The bears were still there, she knew, watching, learning, adapting to the ongoing presence of human technology and human curiosity in their ancient domain. The question was whether the two species could find a way to coexist that respected the cognitive abilities and territorial rights of both, or whether the conflict that had driven them from the valley would eventually escalate into something more serious and more permanent. As her team began setting up their new monitoring equipment, Sarah noticed fresh bear sign along the forest edge. Tracks, claw marks, and scent markings that suggested the local population remained active and aware of human presence. The intelligence that had orchestrated their siege months earlier was still operating in these mountains, still watching, still evaluating the intentions and capabilities of the strange bipedal creatures who seemed so determined to study and document their lives. The work would continue, Sarah realized. The questions raised by their initial encounter demanded answers, even if those answers challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, intelligence, and humanity's place in the natural world. The bears of Broken Creek had demonstrated that intelligence could evolve in forms that science had never anticipated, and that recognition would eventually force a reconsideration of how humans related to the other conscious beings with whom they shared the planet. In the distance, almost at the edge of perception, Sarah thought she heard the low, rumbling call that had marked the beginning of their earlier ordeal. It was answered from another direction, then another, creating a network of communication that spanned the valley and confirmed that the watchers were still there, still monitoring the human intrusion into their domain. The story of Broken Creek was far from over, Sarah realized. It had only just begun, and the chapters that followed would be written by both human science and bear intelligence, in a collaboration that neither species fully understood, but both were committed to continuing. The watchers in the forest would continue their vigil, and the humans would continue their attempts to understand and document the consciousness that watched them from the shadows between the trees. As night fell over the valley, Sarah could feel the weight of intelligent observation settling over their camp like a familiar presence. The bears were out there, she knew, conducting their own research into the strange creatures who seemed so fascinated by their lives and behaviors. The question was what conclusions they would reach, and whether those conclusions would allow for the peaceful coexistence that both species needed to survive in a world where intelligence had evolved in more forms than anyone had ever imagined possible. The silence of the mountain night was broken by the distant sound of communication passing between unseen observers, and Sarah realized that their real education was only beginning. The bears of Broken Creek had much to teach about intelligence, consciousness, and the complex negotiations required when two thinking species attempted to share the same territory. Whether humanity was ready for those lessons remained to be seen, but the teachers were waiting patiently in the darkness, ready to continue the conversation that had begun with a siege and would end with understanding, or something far more complex and challenging than anyone could yet imagine. The watchers of Broken Creek kept their vigil through the long mountain night, and in the morning, the real work of learning to communicate across the species barrier would begin again. The forest held its breath, waiting to see what form that communication would take, and whether two very different kinds of intelligence could find common ground in the ancient wilderness, where both had learned to call home. The next story is Into the Silence. The morning mist hung like a funeral shroud over Lake Wilderness as the group of 8 adults gathered their gear at the trailhead. Dr. Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old emergency room physician from Seattle, adjusted her pack straps and checked her GPS one final time. This annual retreat with her medical school friends had become sacred tradition over the past 12 years, but something felt different this time. The forest seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. "Weather Service is calling for clear skies all week," announced Marcus Thompson, a 35-year-old park ranger whose weathered hands spoke of countless wilderness expeditions. His dark eyes scanned the tree line with practiced vigilance. "But you know how fast things can change up here in the Absaroka Range." The group had chosen the remote Thornton Creek Trail in northwestern Wyoming, a challenging 47-mile loop that would take them deep into grizzly country. It was late August 2024, and the bears would be entering hyperphagia, their pre-hibernation feeding frenzy that made them increasingly aggressive and unpredictable. Dr. James Hartwell, 36, a trauma surgeon with steel-grey eyes and hands that had saved countless lives, hefted his medical kit. "I've got enough supplies to handle anything short of major surgery," he said. Though his voice carried an undertone of unease he couldn't quite explain. Lisa Rodriguez, 33, a wilderness photographer whose stunning images had graced National Geographic covers, was documenting everything with her camera. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her olive skin already showed the healthy glow of someone who lived for the outdoors. "The light is perfect this morning," she murmured, capturing the interplay of shadows and golden sunbeams filtering through the ancient pines. David Kim, 34, a software engineer who used these trips to escape the digital world, powered down his phone completely. 7 days of blessed silence, he said, smiling at his wife of 8 years, Rebecca Kim, 32, a marine biologist whose research on ecosystem interactions had brought her to these mountains many times before. The remaining 2 members of their tight-knit group were Tom Bradley, 37, a former Marine-turned-wilderness guide whose scarred hands and alert posture spoke of battles both foreign and domestic, and Anna Kowalski, 31, a trauma counselor who specialized in PTSD treatment and had insisted on joining after recognizing how much these wilderness retreats helped her friends decompress from their high-stress careers. As they set out on the narrow dirt trail at 7:15 a.m., none of them noticed the massive paw print in the soft earth just 10 feet from where they'd parked their vehicles. The print was fresh, no more than an hour old, and belonged to a male grizzly that local wildlife biologists had designated as Bear 394, a 600-pound, 12-year-old male with a history of aggressive encounters with humans. The trail wound through dense lodgepole pine forest, the air thick with the scent of resin and decomposing leaves. Sarah led the group, her medical training having given her a natural leadership role over the years. Behind her, Marcus served as sweep, his ranger experience making him constantly alert to signs of wildlife. "Remember, we're in prime grizzly habitat," Marcus called out as they reached the first creek crossing at mile marker 3.2. "Keep your voices up, make noise, and everyone needs to keep their bear spray accessible." The morning progressed peacefully as they gained elevation, the trail switchbacking up the mountainside through increasingly sparse forest. By 11:30 a.m., they had covered 8.7 miles and reached Thornton Pass at 9,847 feet elevation. The view was breathtaking, an endless expanse of wilderness stretching to the horizon, unmarked by roads or structures. "This is why we do this," Rebecca said, breathing deeply of the thin mountain air. Her blonde hair caught the sunlight as she stood at the edge of a granite outcrop, arms spread wide. No phones, no deadlines, no trauma codes. Just this. "Nay." James set down his pack and pulled out his binoculars, scanning the valley below. "There's our camp for tonight," he said, pointing to a small clearing beside Thornton Creek, still 4.3 miles ahead. "Should get there by 3 p.m. if we keep this pace." But as they prepared to descend toward the creek valley, Lisa noticed something troubling through her telephoto lens. "There's a lot of disturbed vegetation down there," she said, lowering her camera. "Looks like something big has been digging around the area where we planned to camp." Marcus moved to her side and studied the scene through his own binoculars. His expression grew serious. "That's definitely bear sign. Fresh, too, by the looks of it." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing their options. "We could push on to the alternate site at Devil's Canyon, but that's another 6.8 miles, and we'd be hiking in the dark." Tom Bradley stepped forward, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and alert eyes. "What's your gut telling you, Marcus? You know this country better than anyone." Marcus continued studying the valley below. After 12 years as a park ranger, he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read the wilderness. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. The forest was too quiet. Even the birds seemed muted. "I don't like it," he admitted finally. "But Devil's Canyon site puts us right in the middle of a known travel corridor. Bears use that route regularly to access the salmon runs downstream." Sarah joined the discussion, her medical training making her naturally analytical about risk assessment. "So we're looking at possibly camping where a bear has been active recently, or definitely camping where bears travel regularly." "Pick your poison," Anna said grimly, her counselor's training making her sensitive to the group's rising anxiety levels. David had been studying their topographic map. "There's a third option," he said, pointing to a small clearing marked on the map. "Granite Bench, about 2.1 miles off the main trail. It's higher elevation, more exposed, but it might be safer." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know that spot. It's a good climb, but it's defensible. Rocky terrain, good visibility in all directions. Bears don't like being that exposed." The decision made, they altered course at 12:45 p.m., taking a steep wildlife trail that wound up the southern face of Granite Mountain. The going was tough, with loose scree and exposed roots, making every step treacherous. Lisa documented their ascent, her photographer's eye capturing the way the landscape changed as they climbed, the pines giving way to hardy firs, then to scattered whitebark pine, and finally to the stark beauty of the alpine zone. By 4:20 p.m., they reached Granite Bench, a wind-scoured plateau at 10,200 feet elevation. The site was everything Marcus had promised, a relatively flat area surrounded by granite boulders with clear sight lines in every direction and a small tarn providing fresh water. "This is more like it," Tom said approvingly as he surveyed the natural fortification of rocks. His military experience appreciated the tactical advantages of the high ground. They established camp with practiced efficiency, setting up their tents in a defensive circle with the cooking area downwind and their food properly stored in bear canisters placed 200 yards from camp. James and Sarah worked together to establish a first aid station, while David and Rebecca set up the weather monitoring equipment they always brought to track conditions. As the sun began to set at 7:45 p.m., painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the group gathered around their small camp stove for dinner. The dehydrated meals were a far cry from restaurant food, but after nearly 10 miles of hiking, everything tasted magnificent. "So who's taking first watch?" Tom asked, his question surprising the others. Marcus looked up from his beef stew. "Watch? Tom, this isn't a combat zone." "Maybe not," Tom replied, his scarred hands steady as he ate. "But something's got you spooked, and after 3 tours in Afghanistan, I've learned to trust when the hair on the back of my neck stands up." Anna studied Tom's face in the flickering light of their small camp stove. As a trauma counselor, she was expert at reading body language and stress indicators. "You're feeling it too, aren't you? That sense that we're being watched." The group fell silent, suddenly aware of how isolated they were. The nearest road was 23.6 miles away, and cell coverage was non-existent. If something went wrong up here, they were entirely on their own. "Bears are naturally curious," Marcus said, trying to reassure the group while acknowledging their concerns. "It's possible we picked up a tail sometime today, but as long as we follow proper protocols, we should be fine." Rebecca pulled her fleece jacket tighter around her shoulders. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the peaks. "What kind of protocols?" "No one goes anywhere alone, not even to use the bathroom," Marcus replied. "We keep the bear spray handy at all times. Any sign of a bear, we group up immediately and make ourselves look big and intimidating." James checked his watch. "It's 8:30 p.m., full dark in about 30 minutes. I vote we all turn in early and get an early start tomorrow." As they prepared for sleep, each member of the group performed their nightly rituals with unusual attention to detail. Sarah double-checked that her bear spray was within arm's reach of her sleeping bag. Lisa secured her expensive camera equipment in the bear canister alongside their food. David and Rebecca went through their scientific gear methodically, ensuring everything was properly stored. Tom and Anna conducted a final perimeter check, their voices low as they discussed what Tom had been sensing all day. "It's probably nothing," Anna said, but her training made her hyper-aware of Tom's elevated stress levels. "PTSD can make you hyper-vigilant in situations like this." "Maybe," Tom acknowledged, "but hyper-vigilance kept me alive for 3 tours. I'm not about to ignore it now." By 9:15 p.m., all 8 tents were zipped tight, and the camp settled into what should have been peaceful rest. The stars emerged in brilliant clarity at their elevation, the Milky Way a ghostly river across the sky. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water at the tarn's edge, and the occasional whisper of wind through the scattered pines. But 1.7 miles below them, in the thick forest they had avoided, Bear 394 was following a scent trail with single-minded determination. The massive grizzly had been tracking the group since they'd left the trailhead that morning, staying downwind and using game trails to parallel their route. At 600 pounds, he moved through the forest with surprising stealth, his dark brown fur allowing him to blend into the shadows. Bear 394 had had multiple encounters with humans over his 12 years, most of them ending badly for the humans involved. 3 years earlier, he had seriously injured a solo hiker near Yellowstone Lake. 2 years before that, he had torn apart a campsite in Grand Teton, though the occupants had escaped unharmed. Each encounter had reinforced his dominance and reduced his natural fear of humans. As the night deepened, the bear began his ascent toward Granite Bench, following the same route the group had taken earlier. His massive paws found purchase on rocks still warm from the day's sun, and his powerful shoulders propelled him upward with mechanical efficiency. At 11:47 p.m., Sarah woke suddenly from a dream she couldn't remember. Her medical training had given her the ability to sleep anywhere, but something had jarred her to consciousness. She lay perfectly still in her sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds and trying to identify what had awakened her. A soft rustling came from somewhere outside the ring of tents, like something large moving carefully through the scattered rocks. Sarah's heart rate increased as she remembered Marcus's warnings about bears being naturally curious. She reached slowly for her bear spray, her fingers closing around the familiar canister. The rustling stopped. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear over the pounding of her own heart. Minutes passed in absolute silence, and she began to wonder if she had imagined the sound. Her medical mind catalogued the possibilities. Wind in the sparse vegetation, a marmot or pika moving among the rocks, the thermal contraction of cooling stone. But then she heard it again, closer this time, and unmistakably the sound of something large and heavy moving with deliberate stealth. Sarah unzipped her sleeping bag as quietly as possible and reached for the zipper of her tent door. Protocol dictated that she should wake the others, but she didn't want to create a panic over what might be nothing. Through the mesh window of her tent, Sarah could see the faint outline of the camp in the starlight. The other tents were dark and silent, their occupants presumably asleep. The bear canisters sat exactly where they had placed them, 200 yards downhill from the camp. Movement at the edge of her vision made her freeze. A massive shadow detached itself from a cluster of boulders 50 yards away, moving with fluid grace despite its enormous size. Even in the dim starlight, there was no mistaking the distinctive silhouette of a grizzly bear. Bear 394 stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder as he moved through the camp's perimeter, his head swaying back and forth as he tested the air. His excellent sense of smell was cataloguing every scent. The synthetic materials of the tents, the lingering odors of their dinner, the distinctive smell of 8 frightened humans. Sarah's training took over, suppressing her terror and allowing her to think clearly. She needed to wake the others without startling the bear, which could trigger an attack. Moving with infinite care, she reached for the emergency whistle attached to her jacket. But before she could use it, Tom Bradley's tent suddenly came to life. The former Marine had been sleeping lightly, his combat instincts keeping him alert even in sleep. The moment Bear 394 had entered their perimeter, Tom's subconscious had registered the threat. "Contact," Tom whispered urgently, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Large bear, northwest side of camp, approximately 50 meters. The response was immediate. Years of wilderness experience had taught the group to respond to emergencies with calm efficiency. Tent zippers began opening slowly, and Sarah could see her friends emerging into the night air with their bear spray ready. Marcus took charge with quiet authority. "Everyone stay calm. Group up slowly behind me. Do not run. Do not make sudden movements." Bear 394 paused at the sound of human voices, rising up on his hind legs to get a better view of the camp. Standing upright, he towered nearly 8 feet tall, a mountain of muscle and fur silhouetted against the stars. His small, dark eyes reflected the starlight as he studied the humans who had invaded his territory. The group formed a tight cluster behind Marcus, their bear spray canisters ready. Lisa had her camera in her hands, her photographer's instincts warring with her survival instincts. James positioned himself protectively near Sarah, his medical training making him acutely aware of how quickly this situation could turn catastrophic. "He's just investigating," Marcus whispered, though his voice carried a tension that belied his calm words. "Stay together, make ourselves look big, and back away slowly toward the rocks." But Bear 394 had made his decision. The humans were in his territory, and his previous encounters had taught him that humans were not a significant threat. He dropped to all fours and began moving toward the group with purposeful strides. "Aggressive approach," Tom said tersely, his military training allowing him to assess the tactical situation with cold precision. "This isn't curiosity anymore." Marcus raised his beer spray, though at 40 yards the bear was still outside effective range. "Hey, Bear!" he shouted, abandoning stealth for intimidation. "Get out of here! Go on!" The others joined in, their voices combining in a chorus of shouts and arm-waving designed to make them appear larger and more threatening. For a moment, Bear 394 paused, his massive head tilting as he evaluated this display of human aggression. Then he charged. 600 pounds of apex predator exploded into motion, covering the distance to the group with terrifying speed. Grizzly bears can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, and on the uneven terrain of Granite Bench, Bear 394 moved like liquid destruction. "Spray!" Marcus shouted, deploying his bear spray when the charging grizzly reached the 20-yard mark. The orange cloud of capsaicin and oleoresin hung in the still air, but Bear 394 powered through it with barely a pause. The group scattered instinctively, their practiced unity dissolving in the face of imminent death. Tom grabbed Anna and pulled her behind a large boulder, his military training taking over. David and Rebecca ran for their tent, hoping the thin nylon might provide some psychological barrier. James and Sarah moved toward the rocky outcrop that overlooked the tarn, while Lisa and Marcus stood their ground, continuing to deploy bear spray. Bear 394 chose his target with predatory calculation, veering toward Lisa, whose smaller stature and isolated position marked her as the most vulnerable. The photographer had time for one last shot, her camera's flash illuminating the bear's massive form in stark detail before 600 pounds of fury slammed into her. The impact sent Lisa flying backward into a cluster of granite boulders, her camera spinning away into the darkness. Bear 394 was on her instantly, his massive jaws closing around her left shoulder as she screamed in terror and agony. "Lisa!" James shouted, abandoning his position and running toward the attack despite the obvious danger. His trauma surgeon's training compelled him to help, even as his rational mind screamed that he was running toward certain death. Bear 394 shook Lisa like a rag doll, his powerful neck muscles allowing him to lift her 125-pound frame completely off the ground. The sound of tearing fabric and crushing bone was audible even over Lisa's screams. Marcus continued spraying, trying to get between the bear and Lisa, but Bear 394 was in full predatory mode now. The massive grizzly released Lisa and turned toward Marcus with blood on his muzzle, his small dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that was both alien and terrifying. Tom emerged from behind his boulder with Anna's bear spray, in addition to his own, creating a double stream of capsaicin that finally seemed to affect the bear. Bear 394 shook his massive head and backed away from Lisa's motionless form, his eyes streaming and his breathing labored. "Now!" Tom shouted. "Get her out of there!" James reached Lisa first, his medical training allowing him to assess her injuries even as he dragged her away from the bear. Her left shoulder was badly mangled, with deep puncture wounds from the bear's canine teeth. Blood was flowing freely, and her left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "Compound fracture of the humerus," James reported tersely as he and Sarah worked to stabilize Lisa behind the protection of the boulders. Multiple lacerations, possible internal injuries. She's going into shock. Bear 394 shook off the effects of the bear spray and began advancing again, but more cautiously now. The pain in his eyes and respiratory system had taught him to respect the human's defensive capabilities, but he wasn't retreating. "He's not leaving," Marcus said grimly, reloading his bear spray canister. "Something's wrong with this bear's behavior. They don't usually press an attack after being sprayed this heavily." Tom was thinking tactically, his military experience allowing him to assess their dire situation with cold clarity. "We're trapped. If we try to move Lisa, we'll be exposed. If we stay here, he can pick us off one by one." Anna was applying pressure to Lisa's wounds, her counselor's training helping her remain calm under extreme stress. "She needs immediate medical attention. We have to get her out of here." David had retrieved his satellite messenger from their gear, but the device showed no signal at their elevation. "No satellite coverage," he reported. "We're completely cut off." The standoff continued for agonizing minutes, with Bear 394 pacing back and forth at the edge of their defensive position. The massive grizzly seemed to be testing their resolve, probing for weakness, like a skilled predator evaluating his prey. Rebecca was monitoring Lisa's vital signs with the medical supplies from James's kit. Her pulse is rapid and weak, blood pressure dropping. "James, we're losing her." "I know," James replied tersely, working to stabilize the compound fracture with improvised splints. "But if we try to evacuate now, that bear will finish us all." As if responding to their conversation, Bear 394 suddenly lunged forward, testing their defensive perimeter. Marcus and Tom deployed their bear spray simultaneously, creating a wall of capsaicin that forced the bear back, but he retreated only a few yards before resuming his patrol. "This isn't normal behavior," Marcus said, reloading his spray again. They were running low on canisters, and Bear 394 seemed to be learning from each encounter. Something's driving him to press this attack. Sarah had an inspiration born of her medical training. "Food conditioning," she said suddenly. "Marcus, what if this bear has learned to associate humans with food, previous campers who didn't store their food properly?" Marcus nodded grimly. Food-conditioned bears lose their natural fear of humans. They become aggressive, persistent. This bear thinks we're a food source. Tom was counting their remaining bear spray canisters. "We've got maybe 3 full cans left, plus some partials. At this rate, we'll be defenseless within the hour." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Lisa was going deeper into shock, requiring immediate medical attention they couldn't provide in their current circumstances. Bear 394 showed no signs of leaving, and their defensive options were dwindling. "We need a distraction," Tom said, his military mind working through possible solutions. Something to draw him away long enough to get Lisa down to the tree line. David had been studying their topographic map by flashlight. "There's a steep ravine about 200 yards east of here. If we could get him to follow us there, maybe we could lose him in the rocks." "Too risky," Marcus replied. "Grizzlies are excellent climbers. We'd be giving up our defensive position for uncertain terrain." Anna was monitoring Lisa's condition, her counselor's training helping her recognize the signs of severe trauma. "She's fading fast. We need to make a decision soon, or it won't matter what we do about the bear." Bear 394 made the decision for them. The massive grizzly suddenly charged their position again, but this time he was learning from previous encounters. Instead of a direct assault, he angled toward their left flank, where David and Rebecca were positioned. Tom intercepted the charge with his remaining bear spray, but Bear 394 had anticipated this response. The bear veered away from the capsaicin cloud and circled around their defensive position with surprising speed and intelligence. "He's flanking us!" Tom shouted, recognizing the tactical maneuver. "Fall back to the rocks!" The group began a fighting retreat toward the granite outcrop overlooking the tarn, carrying Lisa between them. Bear 394 pressed his advantage, staying just outside bear spray range while maintaining pressure on their formation. They reached the rocky outcrop with Bear 394 only yards behind them. The position was more defensible, with steep rock faces limiting the bear's approach routes, but they were also more trapped. "This is it," Marcus said, checking his bear spray canister. "Last stand." James was working frantically to stabilize Lisa's injuries in their new position. "She needs surgery within the next few hours, or she's not going to make it." Sarah was helping with the medical work while keeping one eye on Bear 394, who was prowling the base of the outcrop looking for a way up. "There," she said, pointing to a ledge about 8 feet up the rock face. "If we can get her up there, she'll be safe while we deal with the bear." Tom and Marcus worked together to lift Lisa to the ledge, their combined strength allowing them to move her despite her injuries. Anna climbed up to continue monitoring her condition while the others prepared for what they all knew might be their final confrontation. Bear 394 found his route up the rocks, using his powerful claws to gain purchase on the granite face. The massive grizzly climbed with surprising grace, his 600-pound frame moving up the steep rock with mechanical efficiency. "Here he comes," David said, though his voice was steady despite their desperate circumstances. The final confrontation took place on a narrow ledge 15 feet above the tarn. Bear 394 reached their level just as Tom and Marcus deployed their last bear spray canisters simultaneously. The double dose of capsaicin hit the bear at point-blank range, and for the first time, Bear 394 showed signs of real distress. The massive grizzly reared back, pawing at his burning eyes and respiratory system. For a moment, it seemed like the bear spray might finally drive him away, but instead of retreating, Bear 394's pain seemed to enrage him further. With a roar that echoed off the surrounding peaks, the bear lunged forward in a final desperate attack. Tom stepped forward to meet the charge, his military training overriding his survival instincts. The collision sent both Tom and the bear tumbling off the ledge toward the tarn below. They hit the icy water with a tremendous splash, the 38-degree temperature shocking both combatants. Tom surfaced first, gasping from the cold, but Bear 394 was struggling in the deep water. The massive grizzly was a powerful swimmer, but the combination of bear spray in his system and the shock of the cold water had disoriented him. "The water!" Sarah shouted, recognizing their opportunity. "Bears hate cold water. He'll leave now." She was right. Bear 394 struggled to shore and shook himself vigorously, sending water flying in all directions. The combination of capsaicin exposure, cold water shock, and the realization that his prey was more trouble than anticipated finally convinced the massive grizzly to abandon his attack. With one final look at the humans clustered on the rocks above, Bear 394 turned and disappeared into the forest, moving with the same stealth that had brought him to their camp. The group was silent for long moments, unable to believe their ordeal was over. Tom hauled himself out of the tarn, his lips blue from the cold water, but otherwise unharmed. The emergency was far from over. Lisa still needed immediate medical attention, but they had survived their encounter with one of nature's most dangerous predators. "We need to get Lisa to a hospital," James said, returning to his medical assessment. "She's stabilized for now, but that won't last long without proper treatment." Marcus was already planning their evacuation route. "Devil's Canyon is our best bet. It's only 6.8 miles, and there's a helicopter landing zone near the creek junction. If we can get a signal to call for help." David was working with their satellite messenger again, moving to different positions on the outcrop to find satellite coverage. "Got something," he said finally. "Weak signal, but I can get a distress message out." The rescue operation that followed would become a textbook example of wilderness emergency response. Within 4 hours, a medical helicopter had reached the landing zone at Devil's Canyon, guided by GPS coordinates from David's satellite messenger. Lisa was evacuated to a trauma center in Jackson, Wyoming, where James's field treatment proved to have saved her life. The investigation that followed revealed that Bear 394 had indeed been food conditioned by previous campers who had failed to properly store their food. The massive grizzly had learned to associate humans with easy meals, making him increasingly aggressive and dangerous. Wildlife officials made the difficult decision to track down and euthanize Bear 394, recognizing that a food-conditioned bear of his size and aggressive history posed an unacceptable risk to human safety. The decision was controversial among wildlife advocates, but most wilderness experts agreed it was necessary. Lisa spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from her injuries. The compound fracture required multiple surgeries to repair, and she would never regain full use of her left arm. But she was alive, thanks to the quick thinking and courage of her friends. The psychological impact of the attack affected all 8 members of the group differently. Tom found that his military training had prepared him well for the crisis, and he suffered no lasting trauma. Anna's counseling background helped her process the experience effectively, but others struggled more significantly. David developed a severe phobia of wilderness areas and never went camping again. Rebecca found herself waking from nightmares about the attack for months afterward. Sarah threw herself into her medical work with renewed intensity, finding purpose in her ability to save lives. Marcus continued his career as a park ranger, but the encounter with Bear 394 changed his approach to wilderness safety education. He became an advocate for stricter food storage requirements and better bear safety training for backcountry users. James and Lisa's relationship evolved in unexpected ways during her recovery. The trauma surgeon found himself spending more and more time at her bedside, and their friendship gradually developed into something deeper. They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony attended by all the survivors of that night on Granite Bench. The story of their survival became something of a legend in wilderness rescue circles. The combination of proper preparation, quick thinking under pressure, and sheer determination had allowed 8 ordinary people to survive an encounter that could easily have killed them all. But for the survivors themselves, the most important lesson was simpler and more profound. In the wilderness, as in life, survival often comes down to the strength of the bonds between people. They had gone into the mountains as friends, but they emerged as something more, a family forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual dependence. The wilderness had tested them and found them worthy. They had looked into the face of nature's raw power and lived to tell the tale, and in the end, that was enough. Years later, when they gathered for their annual reunions, now held in the safety of civilization, they would talk about that night on Granite Bench. The terror had faded with time, replaced by a deeper understanding of what they had accomplished together. They had faced the ultimate test of human courage and survived. And in a world that often seemed determined to pull people apart, they had discovered the unbreakable strength that comes from standing together against impossible odds. The mountains were still out there, wild and dangerous and beautiful. And someday, they knew, they would return to them. But they would go together, as they had always been meant to do. Because in the end, that was what made them human. Not their technology or their intelligence or their dominance over nature, but their ability to care for one another in the face of overwhelming darkness. The wilderness had taught them that lesson, written in starlight and terror and the irreducible bonds of human love. And it was a lesson none of them would ever forget. Into the silence they had gone, 8 friends seeking adventure. Out of the silence they had come, 8 survivors bound together by something stronger than fear, deeper than friendship, and more enduring than the mountains themselves. The story of Bear 394 became a cautionary tale told around campfires throughout the Rockies. But for those who lived it, it was something more, a testament to the power of human courage when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances. And in the end, that was the only story that really mattered. Not the story of a killer bear or a failed camping trip, but the story of 8 people who discovered what they were truly capable of when everything was on the line. They had gone into the wilderness to find peace. Instead, they had found something far more valuable. They had found each other, and in doing so, had found themselves. The mountains would always be there, waiting with their ancient patience and terrible beauty. And somewhere in those mountains, other bears like 394 would continue their eternal dance between wildness and civilization, predator and prey, life and death. But for 8 friends who had looked into the heart of that darkness and emerged into the light, the wilderness would never again be a place of simple recreation. It would always be the place where they learned what it truly meant to be human, vulnerable and strong, afraid and brave, separate and together, all at the same time. Into the silence they had ventured, from the silence they had emerged, and the silence, eternal and vast and beautiful, would always be waiting for them to return.